Name, Jasun Horsley. Profession, liminalist. This is The Liminalist, the podcast in between. You are now listening.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Great.
Okay.
Good. Well, I was thinking it's been 6 years, just about, a little over 6 years since we last spoke. Certainly a lot of water's gone under my bridge. A lot of changing perspectives in that time. And from what I've gathered, you've been doing a whole lot of traveling in that time.
Yes, I have. Traveling to Europe and Asia mostly.
I think that's one definition of liminal. You're being very liminal because you're constantly in between places and states. And
sure. And there's this cultural dissonance that takes place when you're obviously an American in a country that's obviously not, and you're wandering in a kind of twilight zone where you think you know who you are, but the other people around you are projecting onto you different qualities, and your identity becomes a composite of what you think you are and what they think you are, and then there's a composite identity which is created, by two cultures basically, or two forms of consciousness, and it's interesting.
It's do you find that liberating?
It can be, or it can be restrictive. If I'm an American and I'm in a place where there's a lot of anti-American sentiment, I'm identified with extreme right-wing political views. For instance, I'm identified with the invasion of foreign countries, or with policies with which I do not agree and which I have opposed. So it takes a bit of work to get past some of that.
I was going to say it would take a while to set that record straight. It seems like you have to read all of these books. I've got 3 trilogies, and once you read those, you'll know.
Well, it's sometimes easier just to say you're a Canadian.
Right. So I confess to feeling slightly more overwhelmed by the prospect of talking to you than I usually do doing this podcast. Part of it is that there's just so much to talk about. A difference between you and I is that you do a great deal of this deep background research to the point that you actually seem to be involved in the narratives that you're exploring or uncovering. I mean, you have this uncanny knack. It seems to be in the right place at the right time, which is something we could definitely talk about, but I'll just finish what I was saying. And whereas I'm more of a contextualizer, I don't do a lot of research. My wife does a lot for me if I need it, if it seems like it's needed, but I tend to be trying to unify the material and to find or create a context, like a model, that will recontextualize all of that material. And currently liminality is the thing that I've found. I have this idea that it's a very wide or a very penetrating lens that if used rightly can recontextualize a great deal of material and give it coherence. Mm-hmm. So that would be my hope in talking to you, is that I can sort of mine you for the information that you have, and we can see if we can bring some new kind of coherence to it. Sure. I'm going to go back to that point because I just think it is one that's really, I don't know if it's come up for you before, but I'll even say you seem to have a suspicious knack for being in the right places at the right time, and it does seem like your history, and you don't really write about your personal history, it seems very much, but you do include it in there, has allowed you to, up to the present, to really be, as I said, in the right place at the right time, really be there, very close to the centre of the nexus of things as they're happening. I'm thinking the Berkovich and the Son of Sam, the bookshop you talked about where Lennon and Yoko Ono were hanging about. I just heard about, I think you mentioned on Stormy Weather how you were actually, but at the time that that 9/11 was being plotted. You mentioned that you were just around the corner from where that was going on.
In Malaysia.
Malaysia, yeah. So have you ever wondered about that, and have you ever had to fend off suspicions or accusations of yourself being an operative?
I always have to fend that off. People assume that all the time, and it's a projection, because I think we're living in an age where personal involvement in these things, especially from Americans, is very small. It's easier for us to comment upon what other people do than to actually do things. We don't travel as much as people in other countries. We're not exposed very much. When we're exposed to other cultures, it's because they've come to us. As a New Yorker, I know that you can encounter so many different cultures, languages, religions, simply by walking down the street. So there's a kind of incredulousness when people realize that someone like me has actually gone abroad, has left this country and gone to other countries, lived in other countries for long periods of time, traveled deeply in those places. It arouses suspicion immediately, because that's not what we do,
Right.
So yeah, sure, I have to fend off the idea that I'm an operative of some kind. I was 17 years old when I first encountered that strange church in the Bronx that was operating basically as a cover for intelligence operations. At 17 years old, let's face it, I was not an operative. I was not doing anything. I was still struggling to get out of high school. So, I did a lot of things simply because it was there to do and I could do them, and why not? I was curious, definitely. I grew up at a time when conspiracy theory itself wasn't really highly evolved. There was investigative journalism, which was different, which was a rational approach to trying to understand what the powers that be were up to, what they were doing, and where the connections were. So it was a different kind of mentality. It wasn't a paranoid mentality necessarily, but it was one that said there's something deeper at work here in the world. And it started with me in two different ways. It began with a political awareness, as anybody growing up at that time, and becoming 18 in 1968 with Vietnam and the Tet Offensive and Cronkite and the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, all these things going on, the assassinations that were taking place in 68. Yeah. You had a political awareness, but at the same time there was a spiritual awareness that was also taking place. It was a time of tremendous cultural upheaval, and for me personally it was involved with religion, ideas about religion and spirituality. So for me these two things went hand in hand, which gave me this kind of weird perspective, I think.
Right. And I'm thinking that you must have wondered this yourself, in a sense, not whether you're an operative, but whether, like when you talk about quantum history and the particle and the wave theory of the JFK assassination or any event, like there are these forces, they don't have to be sinister ones, but that do seem to be directing things behind the scenes. There's the human element, and then there's perhaps a non-human element, and then there's definitely a completely unknown element. We could say divine or whatever name we want to put on it, even a liminal element, but the element that can't be categorized. How much have you wondered about that? Like you being in the right place at the right time has actually kind of made it inevitable that you've ended up on the path that you've ended up, and being this researcher and this spokesman that you've become.
Well, I think you've raised a lot of questions. There's a lot of terms that we would want to define probably. When we say there's the human element and there's an element that may not be human, I think in the first place we don't really know what being human is. We're still in the process of trying to figure that out. There's more to humans than meets the eye, to coin a phrase. So I think that we're not necessarily comfortable in encountering capabilities of the human mind that we're supposed to not believe exist. That's part of the problem, I think. If you're a writer, like I am, and I've written fiction and nonfiction, when you get deeply involved in your subject matter, the synchronicities pile up. They pile up exponentially. you suddenly find yourself accidentally finding all the information you need. People that you never met before turn up and are willing to cooperate, to tell you things that you really needed to know. You start to see the world shift kind of in perspective, and all the things that you needed show up. You're suddenly on the river of the Tao, you might say. You're flowing with the Tao, and not being too specific about it, but you're suddenly finding that things are working. They're working as you work, and this is an unusual thing. But I'm not the only person who's mentioned this. I mean, there are people like I was just reading recently John Alexander, the military guy who wrote a book about UFOs, for instance. Even he, in the first opening pages of that book, says, it's really weird, but, synchronicities start to pile up, and suddenly people show up. And I think every writer that I've spoken with, and I've spoken with a number of them over the years, all insist on the same phenomenon. It's not something that's actually discussed a lot, but it happens. So a synchronicity of this information showing up is part of it, and there's another kind of synchronicity in which you yourself show up in the right place at the right time, as you say. Whether this is an unconscious entanglement of connections between yourself and your subject matter, whether it's deliberate in some way, I don't know. I just know that it works, and I'm kind of grateful that it does.
There was a question I was going to save to the end, but I feel like it's appropriate now. Do you feel, as a writer, which is, I think, we both agree, is a much broader and deeper term than most people realize, and more ambiguous. Have you felt, and do you feel? What's your growing relationship to that identity as a writer, to the extent that, or in regard to you having a mission or a sense of a purpose or a larger goal in what you're doing? Do you have a sense of that, of a larger goal?
I think it's not necessarily a subject-object relationship. It's not as though I'm doing this because of this or because of that. It's a natural function. So I don't often sit back and think about it in those terms. And yet, if something tries to interfere with the process, I can get very upset. And that's when I suddenly become aware, you might say, that there's more to this than simply my ego or my income or whatever it may happen to be, that there's something more central, to the work. It's difficult to say, and I think only history will tell. But in the immediate present, when I'm working, when I'm involved in this, it's difficult to explain. It's a sense of empowerment as you're doing it. You feel that you're doing exactly the right thing that you're supposed to be doing. You're reinforced in this idea when the synchronicities, the coincidences start to multiply, and you just go with it. You don't question whether this is a higher calling or not.
I have to say I kind of almost have the opposite experience. I mean, not exclusively. I mean, not that I don't have the experience you're describing, but I also have this experience as a writer of this endless doubt. And that part of my writing exploration process, which I don't know if you'd be aware or not, but if you'd read anything I've written, you probably would be. It's always bringing it back to my own internal process, self-examination in the Socrates sense. That's my only gauge. Like in terms of feeling like I'm uncovering something or I'm doing something that has social worth or social impact, there's an endless doubt about that because, well, for various reasons. But I think, to go to the sort of larger step back to the larger perspective, it relates to this question of quantum history and that the observation affects the outcome, that whole ball of wax, if you will, and that. And also, I was just reading your blog and your about yourself that you'd written, and how you ended on the magician's task is to know, to will, to dare, and to keep silent, and 3 out of 4 ain't bad, and how this may relate to writing. Obviously, you're comparing not keeping silent to writing, and it may be that one of the reasons that keeping silent about these things is prescribed is that if we testify to them, we are possibly reinforcing a reality that we may be seeding memes. I think we inevitably are, to the extent that we're read and the extent that we have influence. That's an area that I'm really unclear about in terms of the responsibility of the writer, which is why I always end up bringing it back to myself. And if I'm being as honest as I can about my own exploration, and if the writing process is allowing me to bust my own illusions, what it comes down to for me, then there's a liberation that comes about as a result of that. But one of the things that I've constantly come up against with conspiracy research is this doubt that, how do I know, and this would be for you this would be much easier to answer, I'm sure, because you do the footwork, the trench work. How do I know that the clues that I'm finding and putting together and recontextualizing into a narrative haven't been planted in order for me to find them, so that I will then create a picture that is actually a cover story, another cover story?
Well, that's always going to be the danger on an existential level. As I say, the looking for validation in your writing, it comes from, I think, the writing itself. If writing requires a great degree of honesty.
Yeah.
You need to be as honest as you possibly can, which may mean that you're deluding yourself in the process if you don't know, who you are, or the extent of what is truth. And we're back to some very deep existential questions there. But the point is that what you write, what I write, what someone else writes is part of the aggregate. It's part of the whole. You may be uncovering, in a sense, another level of disinformation. You may be contributing to the level of disinformation, but as you're writing, you feel omniscient. But when you're published, you're not. Mm-hmm. The writer, as writing, is a creator, is a godlike creature to the work that he's creating. But then that work goes out there with all the other creatures and all the other gods who created it. And I think that the reader, it's up to the reader to decide what is truth, what is not truth. Hence, we have bestsellers that are, pretty crappy, and then we have, books that are excellent, which nobody reads. But it's all out there. Every kind of angle on this, whether it's conspiracy literature or not. I mean, I get constantly called to speak on podcasts and things which are, extreme right-wing radio or right-wing podcast things, which is incredible to me because, anybody reading my work would not come away thinking that I was, a Tea Party person or extreme right. And yet, that's what they're projecting onto the work. It's very strange. So I then go and I try to, I will accept those invitations, and I do talk because I'm trying to say, listen, all conspiracy theory is not the province of the extreme right, as it seems to be these days. It may have begun that way with none dare call it treason back in the 50s and early 60s when there was a lot of conspiracy theory about Kennedy. But then there was conspiracy theory about FDR back in the 30s and 40s and on and on. And, there's this political coloration to ideas about conspiracy, which is amusing to me because it's got nothing to do with that. It has more to do with power, how power is used and abused, relationships between people that are conducive to conspiracy or to secrecy or to plots and all of that. So if you're going to write something and you're worried about if you're contributing to the disinformation, all I can say is, you base your work upon what is verifiable. If your work is good at all, it will be subject to the falsifiability test, right? Is it pure speculation, or is it based on some data that can be interpreted different ways? My point of view has always been show the documentation, show the works, say this is what has actually happened. This are the documents that actually exist. Now you go and see if maybe you can come up with a different narrative that would fit this documentation, and that's fine. I have no problem at all with that. The only problem I have usually with critics is that they will attack the documents. They will say that I didn't say this or I did say that when I didn't, or they will ignore the documentation and say that I'm writing works of speculation, and I don't. When I speculate, I pretty much say I'm speculating. So I think the honesty is in verifiability and falsifiability. The validation of your work comes if, have you been honest, have you dealt with the material in a forthright way? You could be unconsciously contributing to disinformation. I think some conspiracy theorists have in the past. We can talk about Mark Lane as an example of somebody who might have been unwittingly contributing to the disinformation because of some of the things that he did and some of the investigation that he did over the years. Other people can make that accusation against me, perhaps. I don't know.
Are there other areas that you consciously, deliberately steer clear of, stay away from for whatever reasons?
I have steered away recently. I mean, the last not 20 years, but since 9/11, 2001, I've been kind of away from that subject matter. Everybody has sort of jumped on that bandwagon, trying to prove or disprove whether or not it was an inside job, who actually was responsible, et cetera, et cetera. I have kind of wanted to stay aloof from all of that. One of the reasons is all the documentation is not in. We really don't have enough information for me to sit back and say, aha, I think this is where we should go.
I'm sure you're aware there's something you might call conspiracy culture now, which is that the idea of conspiracy or conspiracy theorizing, as it's called, is becoming more mainstream as a phenomenon.
Yes.
Not so much the actual ideas themselves, or rather the possibilities that they're real, but just as this cultural phenomenon that's being written about and discussed.
Sure.
As a belief system, let's say. In the orthodox mainstream, whatever you want to call that, where the official voices are heard, it's being allowed as this phenomenon, as this cultural phenomenon, rather than as an actual reality. On the other hand, in the community that I'm more or less part of, somewhat liminally, somewhat on the edges of the margins, but conspiracy is just taken as a given, basically, that not exactly that everything is a conspiracy, but that any conspiracy, no matter how outlandish, is worth attention and is credible, pretty much. And because I'm not a researcher, I simply don't have the time and the inclination to really go into the documents and whatnot, and I wouldn't feel sure even then, because, as I say, how could I be absolutely sure that the documents hadn't been forged and planted? And it seems like there's no way to be absolutely 100% certain about these things. So I do tend to have a very open kind of lens, as in I'll take on any idea and just see how coherent it is. I'm not sure I'm going with this exactly. I mean, I'll bring out specific examples, like the moon landing is one that in the sort of circles that I frequent, let's say, it's more or less that the idea that the moon landing is faked. I wouldn't say it's taken as de rigueur, as a fact, but it's definitely now pretty much obscured the previous belief that the moon landing actually happened. So it's kind of, there's this sort of liminal state where what we once thought of as facts we've replaced with theories about conspiracies, and really ended up in a place where we simply don't know. I'd say this is the positive outcome anyway, that I simply don't know. I now know that I don't know if humans ever went to the moon, or if that footage is real or not. And that to me seems like an interesting kind of place to be. That's liminality, or that's one aspect of liminality. There seems to be an opening in that, an opening of the mind, an opening of awareness, an opening of the senses even, and a kind of a recognition that we can't know many of these things. So this isn't necessarily leading to a question. I was listening to you or reading recently, and you did refer to the moon landing, and you referred to it as a fact. And I wondered about that. I wonder, is Peter, is that just because there's too much to go into if you even question it, or is it just something that you have researched and you've dismissed? Or what's your, I mean, specifically about that, but also maybe as a response to all the other stuff I've said, I'd be interested to hear your take on this.
Sure, it's quite a lot to address. Let's say you're absolutely right as far as conspiracy culture is concerned, and part of the reason for that is our news, our sources of news have failed us miserably, especially in the last 15 years or so. Our news outlets are basically just mouthpieces. They're giving us press releases from the government or from corporations, and the Woodwards and Bernsteins are not around anymore, or if they are, their mantle has been taken over by bloggers who are doing the best that they can with limited resources at their disposal. So what began as really legitimate investigative journalism has now basically descended into a kind of free-for-all of theory. I have a problem with a lot of conspiracy theory. I have a problem with the term because it's a term that devalues any kind of investigation or any kind of questioning of the status quo of the consensus reality. So I don't like the term conspiracy theory. It's used as a pejorative. But let's just talk about it in general and say, okay, the problem I have with people who theorize endlessly is they do so without data, or they cherry pick data to fit a preconceived idea, which is the opposite of what an investigative journalist should do, right. Which is a more scientific approach. Let's just accumulate the data and see what it tells us. So I have a problem there. I mean, as a person who's physically gone to places of some danger, you might say, in Latin America or in Asia or places like that, I know that the reality is quite often very different. You need, as I've said in, I think in Sinister Forces, I said you need the documents and the blood. I mean, both of these things are necessary. You can't build a theory of reality just on the documents, and you can't do it just upon your personal experience. There's got to be a kind of connection. Your personal experience will never be broad enough to include everything, all of reality. And the documents will never give you the taste of what actually happened, what people were thinking at a time when something went down. So you need both, and you need to actually get out there and do it, but there's, no one's paying for that anymore. You have one guy that they send out to the Middle East, and all the networks use him and his feeds. It's become like that, and it's a corporate game. And with media in charge of so few corporate owners, our information has become tailor-made, and so we're stuck with trying to figure out the truth on our own, and that's why we do what we do. That's why people have conspiracy theories, and that's why conspiracy culture is becoming the norm. As far as the moon landing is concerned, I haven't seen enough documentation to disprove it. I've seen a lot of speculation. I've seen a lot of ideas as to what really happened or what didn't. But I kind of tend to agree that the moon landing did take place. Why not? I mean, we sent so many ships up there and down that were observed by telescopes around the world, that were observed by the Russians certainly, and all the rest of it. But that said, what you're talking about is part of a continuum of consciousness, I think, part of a new paradigm that's taking place, not just in our culture, but in the world in general. We're questioning the moon landing. At the same time that people are asking questions, for instance, about UFOs, about alien technology, about alien abductions, we're questioning reality, what we think of as reality. We're questioning in general on so many aspects. We're questioning the political reality in this country and in other countries. We're questioning, the Russians, what are they really up to in Ukraine? What are they really up to with NATO? On and on. We're starting to question everything because nobody else is. And we're not getting a straight answer, or if we are getting straight answers, they're simply unbelievable. And maybe the unbelievability is what's important. Maybe, for instance, the U.S. government has no clue about UFOs, as an example. Take the most extreme example. Maybe the U.S. government really doesn't have a clue. maybe they just don't want to go there. Maybe because they don't have the technology to deal with it, or they don't have an imminent or immediate threat to deal with, so they don't deal with it. Maybe the reality is much scarier than that, you know. Maybe we're all sitting here living in a kind of fool's paradise where things have already taken place of which we are not aware. So we've lost faith in our institutions in general. We lost faith in our churches, I think, a long time ago. We lost faith in our political systems a long time ago. Beginning with the assassinations, beginning with Vietnam, maybe going back even further. So we've lost faith in all of this. The economy is wiping out the middle class in this country, which was the bastion of consensus reality for so long. So I think that this upheaval is taking place on an unconscious level, and we're reacting to it by believing 6 impossible things before breakfast.
Right. Were you familiar with the liminality, the concept, the anthropological concept?
Certainly, of course, from the Victor Turner, end of it.
Yeah.
Certainly, because I did eventually get a degree in religious studies, so liminality was definitely part of it, and I think that writing in itself is a liminal occupation. You're in a world where something is uncreated and yet wants to be created. You're an interface between an idea and something that appears as a physical artifact. So I think that writing is liminal, and I think that writers are, ideally posed to understand liminality and to describe it.
But I brought it up this time because of what you were talking about, the institutions and the growing distrust in institutions, which of course relates to the conspiracy culture, where essentially we don't trust anything, any of the institutions to represent the truth or to do the right thing, or we just don't trust. I was listening to you saying today, not that you were saying it today, I was listening to it today about priests and how in your day people naturally trusted priests, whereas now they're naturally suspicious of them. There's the, I'm sure you've been aware of in the UK, the growing revelations about the paedophile networks throughout the government in the UK. It was kind of kick-started by the Jimmy Savile revelations. And of course, again, this is hugely destabilizing for the institutions. I mean, in the past, the paedophilia fear, it even seemed like hysteria. Of course, now it seems almost inadequate, but it was directed kind of irrationally at, any weird-looking Jeffrey Dahmer-like neighbours or what have you, the misfits. Whereas now, with what we know, it's clear that the ones to suspect are people in positions of power, or at least people with access, the teachers, the priests, the ministers, the politicians. So there's really the very people in the institutions that we as citizens, if you like, have needed most badly to trust are the very same ones that we're finding it harder and harder to trust. And I relate this to the liminality in that this in its sense is a liminal period. It's a period of uncertainty, a period of structures are collapsing, or at least they appear like they may collapse at any time, and a period of uncertainty, of chaos. And I'm curious about your take on this as far as how it relates to the Girardian idea of mimesis, in that they say, I have read, you may dispute it or want to clarify your opinion on this, but that in periods of liminality we can't turn to the institutions and the kind of established standards and values and morals. They're all under threat, if you will, they're all dissolving. So there's that uncertainty and confusion about how to behave, and therefore we look to others to see how to behave. So mimesis intensifies, and then the possibility of charisma being used and abused in that liminal state of intensified mimesis increases also. So there's this idea of false ceremony masters, which relates to the trickster archetype, who even generate these periods of liminality, who bring about revelations that will cause that will destabilize the institutions in order to create the chaotic liminal period, and then to accrue power within that as these false ceremony masters. I say false because the real ceremony master was one who'd actually been through the liminal phase and come out the other side, and was simply there to guide the initiate, like a beacon, like a lighthouse, if you will. Whereas what we're talking about here is it's a false liminality because it's being generated not as an initiation, but merely to exploit that the chaos in order to accrue power within it. So the false ceremony master uses his or her or their charisma. You could think of Hollywood here and mass media to take advantage of the mimetic qualities in people and get them to control them, basically through that mimetic drive to imitate.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's quite a mouthful to answer. Let me start from the beginning, or at least the beginning as I understand it. I think that part of the conspiracy culture that we started talking about, which leads directly into this, has to do really with the scientific approach to reality. It's the fruit of the scientific revolution, because what does a scientist do but question everything, take nothing for granted, and especially go after the sacred cows, such as religion or political structures and that sort of thing. The scientist does not accept what he or she has been told. They have to go and test. It has to be verifiable. It has to be subject to prediction and to testing. And I think that people have realized they've been lied to so consistently that they now distrust everything. They want to go back and start from the beginning, essentially, and see what there is that they can on which they can rely, something hard, something tangible, because we've been living in a world of absolute false reality, to the point where we've invaded countries and started wars and killed, hundreds of thousands of people on the basis of, false information. This, I think, started, as I say, way back in my lifetime. I could sort of pinpoint it to, the Kennedy assassination probably as a touchstone for my generation, but it probably started a lot earlier for other people. And it was this idea we must question. We are being lied to by someone, maybe by a lot of people, maybe by everyone. So hence you have a conspiracy culture. You have people who are going to question everything. And as you say, we're living in a liminal period, because if you start questioning everything and there's nothing to rely upon, you're going to be looking for people who have gone and come back, as you say, someone who has crossed that liminal threshold and is coming back with the charisma, with the gift of the sight, of the gift of the experience, the initiatory experience. And we don't know how to judge that. We don't have what the Christian fundamentalists call the gift of discernment. So we're going to see individuals come back who claim they have gone there and come back. And through our desperation, we're going to believe them. You mentioned the trickster, and that's a very liminal figure, of course. In alchemy, that would have been Mercury. Mercury, which is sometimes a solid, sometimes a liquid. Mercury, which is a transmitter of information, of communication, the Lord of the Crossroads. All of this, a very liminal character, not just as the trickster, but in ancient terms as the actual God himself. So we identify with people like that. We identify with those people who claim they've been there and come back. How did we start back in the 1970s? By idolizing serial killers, as an example. We have Thomas Harris to thank for that, by creating a character like Hannibal Lecter, who has all the charisma of a shaman, of someone who's gone through the entire process of being broken down and being built back up, and during the shamanic retreat, coming back and telling us, what we all think we know about sexuality, about violence, about reality is wrong. He epitomized the intelligent, urbane person who was simultaneously a mass murderer. We started to identify with people like that because they seemed real. They seemed as though there was nothing particularly phony about them. Their violence, their proclivity towards in Lecter's case, mass murder, was wrapped in this idea that Lecter was a psychiatrist, a healer of mental illness. So he was a shaman. He did go and come back as a psychiatrist. He would have been analyzed, by other analysts, by other psychiatrists in order to get his certification. So we believe that this is a person who's gone there and come back and has something to tell us. And we're titillated by him because he's giving us this message that the shaman can do no wrong, that whatever the shaman does is okay. And that's blown open the doors to all sorts of ideas about who we are, what is reality, what are ethics, what are morals. And we're looking at people who are lying to us so consistently. And we realize that this is all part of our reality now. This is all part of what we have to expect. We have science on the one hand, which seems to have betrayed us. And yet we do have a scientific approach. We want to question everything and test everything, but we don't have the tools to do that. Part of the joke that's on us is that we were never given those tools. We were just told, trust me, everything will be fine. And because of that, we no longer have the tools of discernment. We no longer know who's lying to us and who isn't. So we jump on the more attractive of all the alternatives that are out there.
Well, this is not just that we no longer have these tools, but that we, as individuals, we never developed them, right?
Right. Well, we would have to actually go through an initiatory process in order to start developing those tools. I'm reminded of Israel Regardie, who compiled that famous collection of rituals of the Golden Dawn and published them to everyone's dismay, I suppose, who was in the Golden Dawn. But he always told people not to even embark on a path of spiritual study and initiation unless you had first gone through a period of psychoanalysis. We need to find out where our personal weaknesses are because we've been numbed to them. Our churches have not allowed us really to explore that. Science poo-poos it. We can't afford, hundreds of thousands of dollars for depth psychology lasting over 10 or 20 years. So we're stuck with trying to do this ad hoc, the dummy's guide to spiritual enlightenment, So we're trying to figure out what's the fast way to do this because we're running out of time. And there is no fast way, not really. So we have people who are extremely violent and at the same time extremely charismatic who are saying, trust me, follow us this way. This will be fine. Don't worry about a thing. And naturally, we're now suspicious and we don't know where to turn and we become desperate.
Well, I think this relates to certainty and uncertainty for one thing, that the liminal state is to be endless doubt, perpetually uncertain, and so then we look to those who have certainty as to lead us through it. But of course those who have certainty are not necessarily those who've gone through the other side, but merely those who've there's various ways of putting that, but a psychopath is certainly very certain and has very strong convictions.
Sure.
So I think that this relates to the unconscious. Everything does, I suppose, but how I've been thinking about how the liminal, the novitiate, that is the liminal phase in the tribal society, has to do with the coming of age ritual being a way for individuals to learn to trust their unconscious, because essentially it's a period in which they can commit all the taboo acts. The social restrictions are lifted temporarily, and they're kind of identified with the divine, and like gods, like tricksters, they're allowed to do anything essentially, and the community has to hold a space for that emergence of the id. And it seems to me that that's a way for an individual to come of age by seeing that it's okay to trust in those unconscious urges and let them come through one and express themselves, and that the community won't reject them for it. And so that would engender a trust in the individual, not just in the community but in their own unconscious, and therefore in place of certainty they would have an inner connection, a connection to their unconscious, to guide them through life.
That's correct, and the problem is we don't have that space any longer. We haven't created a space for this to take place. If we read Eliade, if we read, shamanism, his famous text on shamanism, we know that shamans were sent out into the wilderness for a period of time to do just that. That was their space. They underwent all of these tribulations. They underwent the initiatory phase where they were taken apart limb by limb, where their organs were removed and replaced, and they had visions, and they came back whole, and they came back from this experience, and they became a benefit, an asset to their society. They were able to talk to the gods. They were able to predict things. They were able to heal. We don't have a space for that anymore, except in psychiatric institutions. If someone undergoes a process like this, they are institutionalized. They're given drugs, and they're kept in a state of limbo, in a liminal state, you might say, forever. Not allowed to come back, not allowed to go forward. I mean, they're just stuck in this suspended animation. And I think that's the problem that we have in our society. We don't have a space for the shaman, for the real experience of shamanism, which is dangerous, and it's scary. We don't want dangerous and scary. We want to be anesthetized to that. We don't believe that it's good to undergo, a very trying emotional, psychological period in which just to basically to reset ourselves, or to go to another level of awareness and empowerment and spirituality. We don't believe in it because we've lost faith in all of this.
Yeah.
We don't trust psychiatrists anymore. That's certainly true. Ever since all the MK Ultra stuff has come out and all the revelations about how psychiatry has been put at the service of the state, how can we even trust anthropologists? Anthropology has been put at the service of the state. There's been the Minerva project, for instance, from the Department of Defense, which enlists anthropologists basically to spy on other cultures and do anti-terrorism work. I mean, we can't trust our academics. We can't. Academia itself has become such a mess. People fighting for tenure, people saying what they're supposed to say, people writing what they're supposed to write. Everything is questionable at this point. Even the methods that they use are questionable, and we are sitting at the mercy of all of these forces. And there's nothing probably more important in our lives than understanding the nature of reality, understanding spirituality, understanding all of this. This is our life, our lives that are at stake, and yet we're not given any assistance or any freedom to figure out what all of that means. We're just being told to do this or to do that, or to trust someone. And we have to work. We have to spend a lot of time doing things that do not deliberately or directly contribute to our spiritual well-being. And so we live a long life, and towards the end of it, if we're lucky, we have a year or two to think about it, and then it's all over. This is a very depressing state of affairs in the West in particular. There's other cultures that don't. They're not suffering quite this badly. But these other cultures, though, are impoverished cultures. And they're looking to us for guidance, unfortunately. And they're trying to maybe replace the spiritual longings with material possessions the way we've seemed to have done it, and the kind of culture that we're exporting to the rest of the world.
There seems to be a overriding desire to escape the unconscious and to create this semblance of reality or of existence that denies the existence of the unconscious completely, and therefore...
Well, wouldn't you? I mean, at this point, our unconscious is probably a real basket of snakes. We've suppressed so much. We've lied to ourselves. We've been lied to. Going into our unconscious may not be the best thing for society as a whole anymore, and yet it's something that is necessary. What are we going to do? It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah. Well,
Catch-22 is the description of liminality, isn't it?
Right. The double bind also.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was thinking, because when you were talking about this, all the different disciplines being untrustworthy, I was thinking, well, it's to do with, I wouldn't say a result of, because it's the chicken and the egg question as always, but
Sure.
To do with them being infiltrated, like every single discipline, every single field has been infiltrated, whether it's by Christian missionaries, or whether it's by intelligence operatives, if there's even a difference. And how, I mean, that kind of snake pit, as you put it, is just impossible at this point to try and actually negotiate or navigate. But perhaps, and this is where I try to find a context or a unifying theory that I actually can experience directly, it relates again to the unconscious, and how if we deny the existence of the unconscious, it takes over, it takes control of us, paradoxically.
Yes.
You know? Even it is the source of wisdom, but if we deny it, it becomes a devil, a satanic quote-unquote force, because I suppose it relates to the reptilian brain, like the deepest layer of the unconscious is the one that takes control, because that's the one that's powerful, that's driven by the most basic fundamental drives. And so we become driven by that, the dark aspect of the unconscious. It's all dark in the sense that it's unconscious, but there seems to be an aspect that just really is dark. Its very nature is dark in that it's predatory, or
sure.
I mean, when it takes over the whole system, it becomes destructive, but also empowering. And I mean, the experience can be of empowerment. And so see how this relates to the desire for certainty, and how certainty actually isn't. I don't think it's really an option for a true individuatory or individuating journey. I don't think we ever attain certainty. That's my experience. It feels like I get further and further away from certainty the deeper I go into my own inner space, if you will. But that's okay. You don't need it, because there's something that knows. But if you do want certainty because of your own trauma or whatever it is, but the unconscious, as you put it, it's too frightening to go that way, so that you have to move the other way to this semblance of certainty. And then it's about creating this identity that is powerful, that has certainty, that has convictions, which is this Hannibal Lecter that you're describing. I mean, that as a metaphor for that, which I would say is Jimmy Savile. One of the reasons I find this history so interesting is that he does seem to embody much more closely than Lecter did, because Lecter was fictional, the false individuation of the psychopath, which is very Ayn Randian, in fact. And I know that Ayn Rand actually expressed admiration for a serial killer. I forget his name. I don't know if you read about that, but her philosophy did extend to actually holding up a serial murderer as an exemplary of the perfect man.
Well, she did as well with James Bond. She idolized both. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Ted Bundy, but I could be mistaken. As for the serial killer, I don't remember.
It was an obscure one, actually. I'd not heard of.
An obscure one? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But so you have a serial killer and you have James Bond, and what is James Bond basically but a serial killer in service of the state?
Yeah.
So you sure. I mean, she did understand it from that point of view. I mean, she was looking for that sociopathic certainty. It's again, you brought up the idea of mimesis. I guess you're speaking in terms of the René Girard approach to mimesis. I mean, who are we then going to imitate? I mean, what is the person we're identifying with, or the group, or the quality that our culture at this stage of the game? We need to know that, because we need to know who's going to be scapegoated if Girard's template is operable. So we're going to have to figure out, okay, number one, who are we imitating, because that's going to give us an idea as to who the scapegoat is eventually going to be.
And how not to be the scapegoat.
Right? Well, yeah, hopefully, sure. So we're going to need to know that. And I think that it's constantly shifting. I think we're constantly shifting in what we think we want, who we want to emulate, who we think that is the charismatic leader, whether it's a cultural leader or a political or whatever it happens to be. We keep changing that too. Part of the problem with our media, our news cycles, and the internet in general, is that we don't really fix on one given individual or topic or cultural icon, we do shift constantly. That might be a good thing, because we're not going to become followers of a specific individual or group. But on the other hand, it might just be evidence of the fact that we are on shifting sands. We don't know who we are, which may be good for the potential scapegoats out there, because the scapegoat also will constantly shift, until we've settled on one paradigm that we're going to stick with, for the duration. I don't know. I mean, in my years of watching what's gone on, we do tend to shift from, being the cheerleader for this or that group or party or organization or cultural artifact. We don't really fix on anything for any length of time. We had the church for that. The church was giving us who we should hate and who we should like, but now they've lost their credibility. The government's lost its credibility, so we're stuck now with a kind of general consensus view which shifts so it's fickle. I mean, nothing really stays the same. So I think that the Girardian concept is on a quicksand basis right now. We don't really know where that's going to lead us. We don't have an idea. We're looking at today it's this and tomorrow it's that. We are looking to poke holes in all of our sacred cows. We're looking for clay feet in all the idols. And if there's no idols left, are we then stuck looking into a mirror and making up a decision that we're going to be our own idol? Is that where it comes down to? And if it comes down to that, then who becomes the scapegoat?
So how would you see Hollywood factoring in all of this? Because it seems as though that's a heavy machinery of mimesis, and those are very sacred cows, and it's almost as though at this stage people trust and look to celebrities more than they do anyone else, perhaps because they're very liminal, and the element of fantasy is very obviously very dominant, but it's conscious as well. I mean, there's an awareness that one is participating in the empowerment of the celebrity by admiring them and by worshipping them and by imitating them.
Well, celebrities give us fantasy, and at the same time they're giving us certainty. The message in Hollywood films on the surface is formulaic. I mean, it is violence and the sacred. That's basically all Hollywood is about. Right. I always find it remarkable how every single movie involving violence, involving the white hats against the black hats, the good guys against the bad guys, always ends with the good guy having either being stronger physically than the bad guy, or having more technology. We've idolized these ideas to the point where we think that's what solves problems. We're always going to win because we're the strongest, or we have the more guns, we have the more technology, or we don't run out of bullets as fast, or whatever it happens to be. It's not a victory based upon moral issues. It's not a victory based upon anything other than might makes right. Whether it's a cartoon, or whether it comes down to something very violent, name it, almost any film in the last 20, 30 years, there's always been how do we make the famous cowboy films, right? We killed a lot of Native Americans, and we did it because they had bows and arrows and we had guns. It was not a moral victory of any kind. It was strictly a victory based upon technology. We've idolized technology for that long that technology is its own moral authority. And so that's the message we're getting from Hollywood quite often, is that our tools, since we are homo faber, our tools are what makes us morally justified to do whatever it is we want to do. Isn't that the whole colonialist approach anyway? Something that Edward Said, railed against in a flawed, I think, approach to the problem, but still, we're talking about the fact that the colonial powers had the ships, they had the guns, they had the will to go into other countries and dominate them, and that made it right. The others were godless, pagan, or they were not Christian certainly, so we had the right to go and enslave all of these people because of this, and we're still reinforcing that image constantly in Hollywood. It's a colonialist perspective, and we still embrace it. There's very little that's done to encourage us to find other solutions to problems other than the violent solution. There's really no other way. We're not being shown a pacifist approach to this problem, or I think Girard called it a pacifist mimesis, right? I mean, the kind of peaceful, approach that's going to involve, people of like minds, making a rational decision between them, because there is no person of right mind. There are no enemies with which we can have a conversation. Our enemies hate us, and we hate them. There's no common ground, and there won't be unless there is, as Douglas MacArthur once said famously years ago, unless we're being attacked by some, other alien forces from some other galaxy. I think even Ronald Reagan, in front of the United Nations, made that speech as well. Almost wishful thinking, hoping that there would be an alien force attacking the Earth, so we would all get together and defend ourselves. I think that's going to be it. It's going to be a violent confrontation again that brings all these people together, just as it's bringing us together with Iran in the Middle East these days, sometimes and sometimes not. These are all marriages of convenience. There is no real marriage. There's no heroes gamos taking place among all of this. These are marriages of convenience that will disappear and dissipate as soon as the violent threat is removed, and we're back to square one.
Shotgun marriages, even. Yeah,
that's all they are.
Yeah. I guess you're familiar with the term negative identity.
Mm-hmm.
So this is part of the phenomenon that individuals and groups reinforce their sense of identity by juxtaposing it with the other, with the opposition, by taking an oppositional stance to some other, which of course relates to the scapegoat mechanism, although it's not synonymous. And it seems like something we do as individuals as well, like to, because the thing of the scapegoat is the group that, in order not to have internal conflict within and destroy itself, it needs the scapegoat. It needs to all agree that this individual is guilty, then we'll kill him, then we'll raise him up and make him sacred, and we'll stay together until the next build-up of tension requires another scapegoat. It seems like as individuals we do this also. Like we may be this multiplicity, that the ego is merely an imposition on this internal multiplicity of consciousness that gives us this false sense of unification, but that we need it desperately. And the way that we maintain it, and the way that we prevent the internal conflict from completely disrupting our inner unity, which would be a schizophrenic or shamanic dismemberment, is we constantly look for an individual or a group or an ideology to oppose and define ourselves by, or of course a partner. And this happens in marriages. Of course, the one we love becomes the antithetical other.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't lead to a question, but
that's fine. Well, I think that I can only talk about a specific instance that shows you just how this works. I mean, when the Berlin Wall came down and when the Soviet Union fell, I was talking to a bunch of people who were in the military right around that time. And they were saying, oh, how great this is. That's going to be the end. We're going to be, this was the major problem and now everything's going to be fine. And I looked at them like they were insane. And I said, no, it's not. The Middle East is about to explode. You're going to have a lot of really serious problems in the Middle East, especially with extremism and all of that, which I almost experienced directly when I was in China. At one point I was in Beijing, and I was in a taxi, and on another street there was a huge explosion. And it was rebels from Xinjiang province, from the extreme western part of China, who had blown up a bus. They were separatists and they were Islamic at that, Muslims, and they were fighting against the Chinese communist domination of their part of the world. I said, there's a whole lot of enemies out there, and we're going to find one, and we're going to consolidate our military forces and increase military spending, because we're going to identify another threat. I said the world is full of threats, and we're going to define ourselves by what threat it is. We defined ourselves in my generation growing up with communism. I mean, communism was the other. So if you were soft on communism, you weren't an American. You weren't a patriotic citizen. Now you're not a patriotic citizen if you see, the situation in the Middle East very pragmatically. If you don't jump on the bandwagon and talk about Islamic extremism and jihadism and all the rest of it, well, then you're not an American, you're not to be trusted. We constantly, as a nation, as in the United States, we constantly define ourselves in terms of our enemies. The only times that we didn't, we had tremendous prosperity. It's the end of the 19th century. We didn't have much in the way of enemies, not national enemies. But then there was World War I, and we decided to get involved in that in 1917. And then, of course, World War II, et cetera, et cetera. We began defining ourselves this way. The world is full of enemies, and the United States is going to be the policeman of the world, the cowboy, of the Wild West. And that's our self-definition. We just don't have the culture, and I mean that in all senses of the word. We don't have the culture to define ourselves in any other way.
Because when it's not inner oriented.
Right. We are only thinking in terms of duality. There's only a right and a left. There's only the right way and the wrong way, the right way and the non-American way. We love simple solutions to complex problems. And a simple solution is always going to involve a scapegoat. You can't have a complex solution and still have a scapegoat. A scapegoat is a single identity. It's a single entity. It's one-dimensional. A scapegoat has no further dimensions than that. Because once a scapegoat has 3 dimensions, or God forbid 4 dimensions, then we don't know what we're doing. We don't know how to handle it.
Right.
The Middle East, for instance, is our scapegoat these days. That's a multi-dimensional, multi-layered, multi-valenced problem. And we don't want to think of it in those terms. We just want an easy answer. We want an easy identification of the enemy. And as long as we keep doing that, this country is going to keep being stuck in the situation that it is. We don't understand about what we're actually doing. We don't understand our desire to scapegoat. We don't understand it at all. We think we're doing the right thing. And that's why I've written the kind of books that I've written, which call into question some of America's own attitudes in terms of what the Third Reich did. All of the support of the Nazi Party in the United States during the 1930s and the 1940s. And then even after the war, long after the war, the idea that we supported people like this, the easy solution people, against the Soviet Union or against the Chinese or against, Latin American rebels in Central America and South America. We wanted, scapegoats. We desperately need them in order to understand who we are. Manifest Destiny was all about going west and, subduing the native populations there. This is how we defined ourselves as a nation. In order for us to change it, we're going to have to change our culture. We're going to have to change a lot of things. And that's just too hard. It's just too difficult.
You're talking specifically about Americans, obviously, or the US, but do you think that it's so different in the US, or is it just magnified, what you're talking about, this condition?
Well, it's probably just magnified. I've lived and traveled abroad a lot. There's a lot of the similar sentiments, but I don't always realize, I don't quite understand sometimes if some of the same cultural biases are there naturally or if they're there in reaction to ours. It's kind of hard to judge that. America, because it is so large, in terms of the world consciousness, it's so powerful militarily and economically. It has an undue influence in other countries, to a really large extent. So it's really hard to understand sometimes what you're looking at. When you're looking at another country's ideological stance, when you're looking at other countries' cultural proclivities, you don't know if that's really spontaneously from their own culture, or if it's in reaction to what they perceive as American imperialism or dominance of their culture. When you throw your weight around, someone's going to throw the weight back. And they'll probably do it the same way you're doing it. Again, mimesis. Yeah. So there's going to be this kind of, copying of what we are, of what we represent, in order to seize that which we seem to want. So this kind of conflict, again, going back to Jor that he talks about, I think is taking place on a global scale. If we can use his ideas and, port them to a sort of geopolitical framework.
Yeah, well, the metaphor that Girard offers for easy understanding is two children playing, and then one of them grabs a toy, and the other child sees that toy and thinks, "I want that," simply because the first child has grabbed
Right.
it, and the mimetic rivalry begins. So the very desire to be like the other means you end up desiring the same things, means you end up in conflict. So you can see how in the US it's setting itself up as this bastion of progress, of certainty, of comfort, and all the rest of it means that other nations, other peoples want to imitate that, and then they end up in competition and in conflict with it. It occurred to me just a moment ago that I wonder if it relates at all to being a displaced people, because I was thinking about the US and how it began with the genocide of the Native Americans, the sort of cycle of violence that the United States perpetuates, and how that relates, of course, to it wasn't their country
Sure.
to begin with, which made me think of Israel. Again, we've got these displaced people with a history of aggression and intolerance and self-righteousness, I guess, is a very major element of that, which of course would relate to liminality again. A displaced people doesn't feel connected to its environment in the way that it does if it's actually grown out of it, in a sense, or developed naturally in it. I don't even know how that would be described within the field of epigenetics and all the rest of it, but
No, I agree entirely. I
just
mean,
occurred to me.
we don't have roots here. We really don't. Americans do not have, a long history of being in America. I mean, that's just a fact. I mean, we brought slaves over from Africa. We displaced the Native Americans. I mean, the idea of population, divergence, if you will, was constant in our history. We're constantly moving around. We're constantly taking other people's territory. We're bringing some of our religions and our ideas and our mores with us, and they get sort of sublimated here in different ways. There is no direct connection. I wrote about in Sinister Forces that we're living in a haunted house, and we don't know it. We're stepping all over the graves of people who had lived here long before us. We're stepping on, monuments that they built. Earthworks that are phenomenal, huge, massive things. We just don't know. We don't care. We build, prisons on top of them. We do all kinds of strange things here because we just don't know where we are. We don't have a connection to this land. The Native Americans might also have been, latecomers to the territory, but at least they developed a connection to the land, centuries and centuries before we arrived. So, and now we still don't have a connection because we move around so much. We're not defined by the area we grew up in anymore. You meet people who've come from all over. Right now I'm in South Florida. And in South Florida we've got more New Yorkers probably than there are in the Bronx, but yet here they all are. And you meet someone who's a native Floridian and it's a big deal. It's like this is an anomaly. We live in a constant state of liminality, if you will. We're just not connected geographically, we're not, culturally we're not. We're speaking a language that's not really our own. Most of us speaking English, our ancestors did not speak English.
Well, there's a idea which I've verified for myself, which is a psychological idea, which is that if we're feeling a certain way and we're not able to express it or even become conscious of it, what we will do is we will make others feel the way that we're feeling and communicate it that way. So this happens in marriages all the time. Communication breaks down and attack begins, and irrational emotional attacks, and the other person ends up feeling exactly how the first person was feeling, but wasn't able to communicate. They have effectively communicated, you could say, but not in the most healthy of ways. And it was occurring to me that the US, as you were saying, they're constantly moving around, and so they're sort of stuck in this liminal compulsion, whatever that is. But they're also, the notorious foreign policy is that the US is constantly invading these other countries and forcing them into this displaced liminal experience, as if to inflict upon others what they themselves can't deal with, can't consciously process.
Well, sure. If you travel, you go overseas, as I have for more than 20 years, 30 years, something like that. There's no question in your mind as there was to many Americans after September 11th when they said, "Why do they hate us?" My reaction is, "Are you kidding me? You know, really? You don't know?" There's the idea that we've displaced people everywhere. That we not only displaced people, we displaced cultures. Which is even more important. We displace language. English has become the lingua franca around the world. Maybe in 20, 30 years it'll be Mandarin, I don't know. But right now it's English. And when you adopt another language, whether it's for business or whatever it happens to be, it does change consciousness. It does alter your thought patterns. I'm convinced of it. When I studied Mandarin back in the 70s, and I've used it in China, in traveling in China and doing business there, you do change the way you perceive a problem, the way you perceive a situation, the way you perceive personal reactions undergoes a slight shift because now you're doing it, in a different context. The language, is part of that context, or maybe it's central to the context. English does that too. We've displaced that. We've displaced it with Hollywood. We've displaced it with music. We've displaced cultures everywhere. They're fighting back, little by little. If you live in Southeast Asia these days, American culture is not as powerful as, for instance, Korean culture, oddly enough. Korean television is very popular in countries where they don't speak Korean. Korean music, Korean videos, Korean pop music has become very popular, for instance. You see this idea, this pushback. Let's adopt the methodologies that the United States uses, and let's try to use our own culture as the filter through which we can do this. So there's this idea that we're trying to take back our culture, but is it really happening? When you have Gangnam Style, Korean videos, is that really purely Korean, or is that, a Korean response to an American concept? And, is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's going to be for social commentators to come up with later, if that, contributed to some sort of erosion of Korean culture in this particular case. But it's true, it's a fact, it's happening, and we have to understand that it's happening and find a way to address it. So yes, we're displacing people through war, we're displacing people through economics, and we're displacing culture for sure. And we're displacing, of course, language is part of the cultural displacement that's taking place. And that's why people, are reacting. That's why there's a lot of people who are against not just the United States, but the West in general, as they perceive the entire West to be this vast colonialist, imperialist power that's bent on, ruining the cultures and spirituality of people around the world.
Because it'd be a way to assert, a way to avoid that distress or that anxiety of being liminal, of being displaced, is to displace others, not just because it's putting one's own demons into them, so to speak, poison receptacles is what Lloyd DeMaus calls it, the psychohistorian, but also because it reinforces, it's very much like the pattern of abuse. The powerless can only feel powerful by overpowering others and causing them to feel powerless and putting the poisons and the anxiety into them, and reinforcing the illusion that in fact they are powerful.
Well, we have to keep doing it because it validates the original crime.
Right.
We have to invade other countries because that validates the fact that we invaded this one. It makes it look right. It makes it look like it's part of the pattern of history, that it's an inevitability in a Marxian sense. So we're saying that this is what we do, and it's right and justified because we always win when we do it. Our displacement of the Native Americans is then paralleled in the displacement in Iraq. To not to make too broad a point, but this is what we're doing. We're displacing hundreds of thousands of other people, killing off a bunch of others, and they are quote-unquote others. And we're doing that, and we feel justified in doing it, or we don't feel justified, but we have to keep reliving that original crime to get to the point where we feel comfortable with it. And we're never going to feel that comfortable with it. That's just a foregone conclusion. We're never going to feel comfortable with having, slaughtered the Native Americans, and slaughtering a bunch of Iraqis is not going to improve it. But yet, in our psyche, I think that's all part of it. The way people talk, if you listen to, some of the talk radio, which is vitriolic, and the type of conversation that takes place there, the type of statements that are made, we might as well be talking about, the cowboy and Indian films. It's the same kind of invective. It's the same kind of us versus them. It's the other, that the great unwashed, the savages that we have to kill. We have to kill savages all the time. We characterize these people as savages, and yet we're the ones doing all the murdering.
Yeah.
So.
What you're describing there, about having to repeat the crime over and over again in order to avoid the awareness that it is a crime, in order to prevent conscience from coming into awareness, it struck me that it's a kind of desensitization process, and it's something I've been looking at and I wanted to bring up with you today. If I had time, there's so much. Jimmy Savile again led me to think about this, the idea of false individuation through violence. The idea came to me when I was reading about liminality in the anthropological sense, and you'll be familiar with this, I'm sure, the whole idea that taboos, that there's a magical element to committing taboo acts. It's a way to empower the self by going against the social taboos. And Crowley is an obvious example, and this tradition is through all the different magical traditions. I'm sure that you come across it all the time, and it occurred to me that that this has to do with, like, if individuation entails owning one's unconscious, which, as I talked about, happens in a true liminal ritual, and becoming an individual in a true sense that is connected to the divine or to the collective unconscious, or whatever we want to call it. It also entails separating from the group, in a sense, becoming an individual who isn't defined or restricted or influenced by groupthink, by the group mind, who can tune into his or her own sense of reality. That would be a very quick definition of individuation. And this is an inner journey. But it occurred to me that, although it can be, facilitated by the outer rituals, it occurred to me that a psychopath may be attempting individuation in a way that avoids the unconscious once again, by essentially committing these taboo acts over and over again as a way not just to set him or herself against the group, because obviously that happens if you're a criminal, but to attack the internal ideology that can have a semblance of efficiency. Like, it can lead to a feeling of empowerment, in the sense one is becoming liberated, has a sense of being liberated from the impositions of society, but that because it's done through violence, unconsciously the person is reenacting the traumas or whatever it was that that imprinted them with those values to begin with in a negative way. What they're doing is attacking themselves unconsciously. So it's as though I can imagine, like, an ideology or a social value system, if you will, as kind of hardwired into the nervous system. Let's say you're talking about language, and they've done studies how language actually gets embedded in the body, so that when we use words, our body is like Reich's body armor. Our body, there's these micro movements in the body that correspond with words. So language and social ideology, it goes into the nervous system, and this false individuation through acts of abuse, acts of violence, it's a way to rip out that ideology, but because it's embedded in the nervous system, it actually does violence to the self. And the reason that it's effective is that it's this desensitization. It's as though it actually keeps the unconscious material repressed, because if you keep attacking the psyche in this way, you keep reinforcing the split, the fragmentation that caused the pathologies to begin with. The split just gets wider and wider, and so the negative identity of the ego becomes more and more isolated, and therefore, in a sense, the illusion of power is greater, because it experiences itself as individual and separate. But the price of that is that the soul or the psyche becomes banished, if you will.
Well, I think that violence is critical the idea of violence is critical to individuation one way or the other. I think that the shaman, in the Eliadian sense of shamanism, the shaman experiences internal violence. He internalizes the dismemberment. He internalizes the murder, the decapitation, the bloody act of murder is internalized. It's something that he experiences himself. He undergoes this process. He is the victim as well as the victimizer. He comes back from that experience individuated. The murderer, the killer, the pedophile, people who are engaging in this repetitive violent acts are people who've not been able to internalize it. They are externalizing this violence. And they have to keep doing it because they haven't reached the stage at which they have integrated these parts of their personality. What they're trying to do is integrate all of society into their psyche by these acts, these physical acts of violence towards others. And of course that doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't. There's too many people. The society is far too vast and too large to internalize using this method, and it's just not going to happen. So they have to keep doing it and do it, and that's where they get their sense of power. That's power over other people as a substitute for the individuation process, as you pointed out. I think that maybe it's possible that this externalizing of the shamanic impulse, this externalizing of the violence, may be a reaction in the modern world against the lack of space in which to internalize it. There's no space for this to happen anymore. We don't respect that type of impulse. We think it's a psychological disorder. So I think that this externalization is going to be inevitable as long as we don't have a place for people to internalize this. I wrote in Sinister Forces that a shaman, a serial killer, is a shaman who has not made it back, who's not come out of the forest. The serial killer is the shaman is a shaman in training, is a shaman who hasn't quite made it yet, and so they have to constantly reinforce this shamanic initiation by killing other people, especially in horrific ways, because they're trying to experience this internally and they can't, because they've externalized it too often, too much. The formula they're using is doomed to failure because they would have to kill every single person on the planet in order to get this kind of, the kind of release that they're looking for. It's just not going to happen, and even then it wouldn't happen. But there's something else that what you were saying that triggered something in my mind, and that is the idea of individuation itself. Of course, we all know, the Jungian approach to it and all of that, but Jung was conscious of the fact that Western society in general is schizophrenic. We have a schizophrenic attitude, mostly brought about by Christianity, probably, which caused this split between, psyche and eros, between sexuality and rationality, or whatever you want to call it. So we've grown up in a kind of schizophrenic state, and it may be that individuation, in the Jungian sense, is a Western issue. I've lived among people in other cultures, especially in Asia, where the individual is defines themselves, finds their identity through community, through identification with community, almost as if they were an extension of community. And to go off by themselves, to quote-unquote find themselves and become an individual, is considered very strange. And again, it would be done by shamans, by people who are deliberately becoming outcasts, the transgendered, for instance, homosexuals in some cases, in Indonesia as an example. So they would be in this separate category, and they would be considered, to be spiritually different. And to be spiritually different is sometimes to be spiritually powerful as well. So it's not quite the same experience there, I think, and I could be wrong, but I don't think it's quite the same experience in one half of the world as it is for the other half.
Yeah.
I think we need to go through this individuation thing. I think for us it's a major issue because we are so dislocated from society anyway.
Right.
So we're falling back on ourselves. We're trying to find out who we are. But in those other cultures, especially agricultural societies, there seems to be this deep connection both with the land and with the community, and they find wholeness through maintaining this kind of relationship. And again, I could be projecting, and I could be, making some colonialist error, but it does seem to me, from the people that I've spoken with, people who have argued against Western ideas of the individual, that they find their greatest satisfaction in being part of these huge extended families. So I don't know. Maybe individuation is a cultural artifact as well.
The writer Paul Bowles, who lived in Tangier for most of his life, he once said that Arabs didn't have an unconscious in the way that we understand it or think of it. And I'm not exactly sure how he meant that, but I would think that he meant that their unconscious was bleeding through into their lives in such a way that there wasn't a clear dividing line between, which would also be a way of saying that they didn't have egos in the way that we think that we experience that.
Mm-hmm. I think he might have been onto something. I don't know specifically about Arabs, but certainly when it comes to Asia, I think it is a different psychic structure that we're talking about, or at least a different psychic mechanism. I'm sure we all share ego, id, and all the rest of it, but I think the way it manifests in different parts of the world is different. And I think that you don't have the same types of psychological maladies there that you do here. I think it's different proportions of depression or of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, etc. Different numbers of them, different depressions, and it might different expressions, and it might be in reaction to, again, the presence of Western culture. That may be having something to do.
Yeah, it's interesting that one of the tropes of Western culture is particularly Americanism, which is the only nation that has turned itself into an ism, I realised the other day. That it is to impose the idea of homogeneity, that we're all the same. That's very kind of central to the American conceit and the Western conceit, it seems to me, and it's even the political correctness of that, the enforcement of that idea, that there are no differences between people. Of course, it goes hand in hand with irrational hatred of groups of people.
Sure. Well, it's a universalist conceit. One of the charges leveled against people like Eliade and some of the others is that they were universalists, assuming that everyone is the same. And the problem is we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there is a lot of similarity. We're genetically almost identical. We conceive, give birth, and all the rest of it all the same way. But of course, psychologically, spiritually, we're not the same. But we try to impose this similarity. I mean, how else are we going to go to a country like Iraq and insist that they become a democracy overnight? Like this would just be the natural expression of everybody around the world, is to go and vote, and not settle their problems with machine guns. Especially when we do that, we settle our problems with machine guns. But we're expecting that the Iraqis will not, that they will be peaceful and vote, and everything will be, copacetic, and nobody will have an issue. Of course, I mean, if we didn't believe everybody was the same, we couldn't do half the stuff that we do overseas. It's
like the Star Trek now, as the Enterprise has the prime directive not to interfere with other cultures, but every episode they break it because they know that their way is the right way, and they're just helping the natives along. There's no question.
That's been our conceit since the beginning. And not just us. I mean, it's been all the colonial powers. They've had that conceit since the beginning. I think the Dutch in Indonesia were a bit more pragmatic about that, as far as they only worked with the noble houses and tried to stay aloof from everyone else. But it still backfired. I mean, the whole thing was a mess by the time they got through with Indonesia. The British, of course, as we all know, and India and around the world, and the Americans everywhere, we do have this idea that we do know what's best for the natives, after all, they're savages, and we're still enacting this in all the parts of the world with which we have some kind of a complaint. And it's a psychological position, and it's disguised, as a political position, but it's not. There's no political justification for, half the stuff that we do. It's really a psychological, position that we're taking. And we're taking this position that, the other people are not mature enough. They're not, they're still adolescents. We have the idea that we're the adults and everyone else is an adolescent. They need to be brought up. They need to have tough love. I mean, these are all ideas that have absolutely no basis in reality, but we're very comfortable with them. Thank you very much.
It's interesting you're saying it's a psychological position, because I would certainly agree. I would say that about it, pretty much any kind of behaviour, any kind of behaviour, that psychology trumps any other interpretation. But it also occurred to me that what you're describing, I mean, the obvious example would be the missionaries, Christian missionaries, and how that relates to the idea that you're exploring now of weaponizing religion, how religion has become a tool of politics, but then that is, as you're pointing out now, really a tool of psychology, of individual psychology, to prop up its own illusions and delusions and whatever else, we could deconstruct there.
Sure. If we demonize, let's say Islam, because that's the hot button topic these days. If we demonize Islam, the reflex of that is we're elevating Christianity. We may not say it as such. We may never even mention it in the same breath. But that's the idea. We're elevating Christianity, and by elevating Christianity, we're elevating Americanism, as you might say. So that's what's happening. It's a reflex. It's psychological warfare. I mean, in plain and simple. We've weaponized religion to the point where, religion just isn't religion anymore. We've weaponized it in the case of Islam. We weaponized it deliberately against the Soviet Union. The Nazis, of course, weaponized Islam also against the British and the French and the Soviet Union. So the idea was, let's use religious sentiment as a weapon. Let's manipulate the sincere religious feelings of other people, non-white people. Let's control those emotions and use them, to fight our own enemies, because we know how powerful it is. That's exactly what the other groups are doing in the Middle East too. They're weaponizing their religion against their enemies. I'm speechless in the face of it, because it's so obvious that that's what's taking place, and yet people seem to want to be manipulated that way. They're comfortable with it. They've got to know that they're being cynically manipulated, but yet they don't seem to care, because it's working out to their favor. They're being able to use our influence in ways that are productive for their own ends, which is why we always get bitten in the ass later. We never understand that people have their own agendas. People understand what we're doing, and they're willing to exploit what we're doing for their own ends. And then when something goes wrong, we don't understand it, like the Taliban in Afghanistan as an example. We weaponized Islam to fight the Russians, and then when the Soviet Union fell and they left Afghanistan, we were shocked to find that these people would turn their guns against us. I mean, are you kidding me? Did you realize what you were doing when you weaponized Islam? Did you realize what was going to happen inevitably from the outbreak of that? Eisenhower, in the Oval Office, in I think it was 1952, said to Allen Dulles, "Why don't we cause a holy war, in the Middle East against the Russians?" And Dulles, one of the most pragmatic people you probably ever want to meet, said, "But Mr. President, what if they turn against us?" He actually was afraid that was going to happen. And it was Eisenhower who said, "Don't worry about it. The King of Saudi Arabia is a good friend of mine. Everything will be fine. Don't worry about it." I hate coming to the defense of Allen Dulles, which I've never done before except in this instance, but Dulles obviously saw that there was going to be a real problem if we weaponized Islam against the Soviet Union, and it turned out to be absolutely 100% correct. There's fallback from all of this. We don't understand psychology, yet we try to manipulate it. We don't understand religion, and yet we try to manipulate it. It's the sorcerer's apprentice, as I always say. It's that Mickey Mouse scene in Fantasia where he's found the magic book and he's making all the brooms dance around. And that's what we do. We don't realize, we haven't read the next page, and we don't know what's going to happen, how to control this. Once the genie's out of the bottle, it's out of the bottle. And we've just never learned about this. We think we understand psychology, we think we understand religion, and we really, really don't.
I would say a theory. I don't like that word either, but I'd say it's a practice even in this regard, and it relates to how the moment that we perceive a situation as a problem, we then perceive as something that needs to be dealt with and addressed and fixed. And in that moment, metaphorically, it's not literally a moment, we cease to be able to see it. Because it's like everything, if we have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And in contrast is the I don't want to say the spiritual path. Let's say the true psychological path or the true spiritual path, which is simply to become aware of the issues, of the delusions, of the blind spots, and that's it, and not to allow that part of us that wishes to solve them, to resolve them, to fix them, to change them, to enter into the picture, to inhibit that part, because as soon as it comes in, it takes over, and when it takes over, it begins to distort the evidence, and we're no longer seeing it because we're trying to control it, as opposed to the alternative to that, which I think is that actually seeing a situation as it is, even if it looks like the biggest problem in the universe, like damnation, let's say, for the Catholic mindset, will change it. Just the act of actually seeing it and inhibiting the desire to attack as a problem, it will naturally and spontaneously change. Not instantly, of course, but the process of seeing itself transforms what's being seen, I think.
Sure. But you have to see it, with open eyes, and that's what we seem to have difficulty doing in the West these days, is seeing something with open eyes, really seeing it. I think there's something to be said for, Hindu and Buddhist ideas of non-duality, trying to erase the difference between subject and object, or between us and something else, which basically means erasing liminality. If there's no difference between myself and God, or myself and Buddha, for instance, then there is no liminality left to consider. There's no danger of going back and forth or being stuck in this limbic position where, we don't know where we're going, where we're coming from, or what action to take.
That's interesting, because when you were describing, I was thinking, oh, that's liminality, and then you said that's erasing liminality. So maybe it's both, in the sense of what I was saying earlier, that the way to erase liminality or to become fused with the subject and object is to embrace liminality, is to allow oneself to remain in that state of in between and accept that that's it, that's the ultimate state, and then that would be crossing the abyss. The abyss is the ultimate liminal experience, I imagine. I have to imagine. I'm not going to testify. But yeah.
Well, yeah, is there a difference between sacred space and secular space, profane space? The old, Zen, parable that before I studied Zen, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers, then I studied Zen, and mountains were no longer mountains, rivers were no longer rivers. And then when I accomplished Zen, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. The idea of erasing the difference between sacred and secular space, between the profane and the divine, erasing that distinction. Does that mean you're living in a liminal space, in a constant state of liminality? Or does that mean that liminality has ceased to exist? Or maybe it's the same thing. Yeah. Maybe, if you're living in a constant state of liminality,
there is no liminality.
Then there is no other. Yeah. But that's too deep even for me. So.
Well, it's just deep enough, I think. But I had to leave a pause then because, well, actually, partly because it demanded a pause, but also because I was going to take a complete change of subject. If you're up for staying on for a little bit longer.
Okay.
It's not a complete change of subject, but it will sound like it when I begin. I've been looking into Kubrick's work a lot recently, not as a fan, as an anti-fan. I've always disliked Kubrick's films, and for whatever reason, it's part of what I'm exploring. And while you've been talking, two of his films have come to mind. One was The Shining, when you were talking about the living in a haunted house, America being a haunted house, and how it relates to taking the natives' land away from them, and how that's a Hollywood trope, right? You get the hotel or whatever it is that's on the Indian burial ground in Poltergeist that causes all this paranormal phenomena, and what a great metaphor that is for what we've been talking around, the whole, the unconscious, and how either you go there and find out what's there, or it will possess you. So that was the first one, and then the other one was 2001, when you were talking about the tools. You were talking about movies and how the battle's always won either through technology or through violence or both. And of course that made me think of 2001, how it tracks this linear narrative from the discovery of the first tool, the bone, which is used as a weapon, snap cut to several million years ahead, and then the bone turns into the spaceship, and it's subtly indicated, but it's part of a war industry, the technology that we're witnessing. And then the climax of 2001 is I would say, pseudo or quasi-shamanic journey, because as I say, I'm not a Kubrick fan, and I've been looking at 2001 as a kind of propaganda film around the very ideas we're talking about, how violence has this sacred dimension, how it is what makes us men, first of all, humans, individuated, but also how it leads to transcendence and regeneration, basically, through conquering space, through going outward once again, not inward, but outward. I'd be interested on your take already on any of that, but also how it seems we have been talking around ways in which violence and political control and ego agendas, all of that does relate to religion, not just as a tool of control, but as I say, as a dissociation mechanism for creating these fantasy realms in which to withdraw, under the illusion that we're actually ascending and transcending, which of course the space colonization program, which can be linked to the Nazis, is a literalization of that desire to transcend, but also of course it's escaping the earth, so it's trying to separate from the mother.
Well, interesting you brought up the Nazis, because as you were speaking I was thinking specifically of Ludendorff, one of the early supporters of the Nazi Party. He took part in the beer hall putsch with Adolf Hitler in 1923. It was Ludendorff who came up with this idea that the natural state of humanity is the state of war. He believed in the theory of constant warfare, that people will only realize their true potential and their true glory, you might say, during war. And at the same time, he also, of course, was a theorist of the idea of total war, that an entire country had to go to war against an entire other country. The idea of using armies to fight only armies and not civilians to fight, and not armies to fight civilians and vice versa, was an outdated concept, that the only way to win a war was to fight an entire population with everything you had. And you had to stay in a constant state of warfare because that was transcendent. That's what was the natural spiritual state of human beings. And I bring this up because Ludendorff, in his later years, became a mystic. I mean, he founded his own occult society, this guy. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine. Here was a famous World War I general with the spiked helmet and the whole thing, suddenly becoming this sort of weird kind of neo-Gnostic, neo-pagan mystic towards the end of his life. And believing that he had, this whole idea of total war and constant war was part of his mystical construct. Right. That he felt this was man's, when I say man suggestively, this is man's natural state, was to be in a constant state of war. The idea of conflict as a prerequisite to spirituality, a spiritual breakthrough, of taking spiritual wholeness, I think it is there. I mean, in whether we want to agree or disagree with people like Girard or anyone else, I think that the idea of conflict is there. I mean, we don't attain deeper insights without some kind of conflict. I mean, whether it's psychological conflict on a couch in a psychiatrist's office or, whatever it happens to be, there's going to be conflict. There's going to be violence if it's internalized. There's a great deal of that in the spiritual process. Every initiation that I know of into secret societies has to deal with the threat of violence. A Masonic initiation where you're blindfolded and brought in at the point of a sword, or when you're buried as if you're dead and then taken out of the grave. The idea of violence, of violent death, of conflict with people around you, conflict with society is all part of it. Like it's as if you have to be at war with society to find yourself. Now, does a nation have to be at war with all other nations to find itself? And that seems to be what Ludendorff was talking about.
Okay. I could respond to that, but I'd be curious to hear more thoughts from you on some of the other stuff, though, as well. The religion is the dissociative possibilities of that. Because, for example, when you're talking about the rituals, the Masonic rituals, I would see that as one more symptom rather than as evidence that it really is inherent or intrinsic to the spiritual journey. Like in my own life, for example, which is the only thing I've got as real evidence, I was on the magical path, the will to power, through occultism. Castaneda was my main influence for 2 decades, and the purpose of that path for me was very simple. It was to realize the folly and the futility of that path for me. Mm-hmm. And that's a very valid, I mean, that was essential. I didn't choose to be on that path. I was driven by my own patterns and my own trauma and my own internalized violence that I didn't consciously choose to try and become powerful that way. But as I say, it was essential. Because of that, it was essential for me to discover that. And part of that discovery is this fairly deep sense that 99% of the methodologies that have been kind of propagated about spirituality are symptoms of a pathology rather than cures for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to clarify one thing, that I was not suggesting that what Ludendorff said was correct, just that this was his attitude, his approach, and of course it's colored a lot of thinking since then among people who are sort of pro-fascist or pro-Nazi, who believe that this is the new man, quote unquote, will be born out of this environment of constant war and total war, and the new man was this goal of both the fascists and the communists.
And this is
the idea they were creating.
Sourced in Nietzsche, I guess.
Yes, sure. So this is the will to power again, as to bring up that phrase. Yeah. But as far as what you're saying, is it symptomatic of an illness, or is it like you said, 99% of it is seems to be symptomatic of a dysfunction? Probably. I don't see why it wouldn't be, because we are living, proof that we're all dysfunctional. So we're coming up with strategies that are reflective of the fact that we are, dysfunctional, that we are, we're trying to find a way in which to solve the problem of individuation, let's say, or the problem of spiritual or psychic wholeness. And because we see such an array of darkness ahead of us where this is concerned, so many issues and so many problems, we define the problem in terms of violence. Well, at least we define it in terms of conflict. I think that even if you take the Christian hermits, who, like St. Anthony in the desert, he's sitting on top of a stone pillar somewhere, and he's meditating and he's praying and he's praying and he's just trying to get at one with God, but he's surrounded by demonic forces who are trying to rip him apart.
Simon?
That's one of them, yeah. Simon St. Anthony as well, okay. Yeah. Simon Stylites was on top of a pillar. I think St. Anthony was too. If he wasn't, he was in a cave in the desert. But at any rate, they were both being beset by, fantastic demons who were trying to rip them apart. These visions that they had of this, I guess, unresolved psychological material. Yeah. And it was addressed through, conflict, and you might say through violent conflict. It doesn't necessarily mean that St. Simon, St. Anthony, or the others were aggressively fighting. Maybe they prayed all the harder in order to defeat the demonic forces, but defeat them they had to do. It was a conflict that they had to resolve. I think the tools that we use may be cultural, may be culturally loaded, I don't know, but the the interpretation you just gave seems perfectly fine to me. It's just that I don't know if I would consider that a value judgment necessarily,
Right.
but just an observation that this is probably the technology or the methodology that we may find a requirement for most of us.
Yeah, well, it's a good point about the value judgment, because I mean, I'm aware of that, because that magnified is exactly the pathology we were discussing around the US, and perhaps even calling it a pathology is a value judgment. But I'm very aware of it in myself as this desire to identify what's right from what's wrong, as opposed to what's real from what's unreal.
Wow, that's two entirely different problems, aren't they?
Well, absolutely. And I would say the right and wrong is a false problem or a pseudo problem.
Yes, right.
Whereas the second is the problem, the only problem. Maybe it's not a problem, but it's the situation that we're in. We have lost or never developed that power of discernment. So yeah, we don't have the ground. We can't find the ground to even take the first step towards the future, so to speak.
Right, because we don't know where we're standing.
Yeah, which ties in with what I was expressing at the beginning about my doubts as a rider. Like, if I don't really know where the ground is, I must be very careful not to appear to know. Because not only will I just fool others, but I will fool myself.
Certainly. Of course, I agree.
Yeah. And that sort of brings back to my truck with 2001 was, I don't think that Kubrick was actually, well, I don't know, but whether he was consciously doing propaganda. His defenders say that he was aware that he was being used to create propaganda, and so he embedded the film with clues that this was propaganda. You see how complex it gets.
Well, he did the same thing in The Shining, according to his apologists, that there was information in there about the moon landings, for instance.
For example.
For example. So, yeah, it's possible. Kubrick might have been doing just exactly that. I mean, Eyes Wide Shut is the film that everybody says is giving the show away. I'm not sure I agree, but anyway, that's the general narrative these days.
I don't agree with that either, no. I think it's a very unrevelatory film in that regard. But without getting sidetracked into Kubrick, perhaps... what do you think about or have you thought about the correlations between the bid to conquer space and the weaponizing of religion? Well,
it's all of a piece. We are struggling with this problem. Virtually every book that I've read recently, reports that I've read to online stuff regarding space, brings up one way or the other the idea of religion. Will there be a threat to world religions if we encounter, another civilization somewhere? How will that threat be defined? I mean, will it cause panic? Will it cause hysteria? This idea that religion is like part of this whole gestalt in some way. The idea that, Edgar Mitchell landing on the moon planted a Masonic flag or something. This idea that there's this connection between the space program in general and religion, I think is there at the very heart of what happened. I mean, if we go back to the origins of NASA, if we go back to the origins of the Jet Propulsion Lab, we find a lot of esotericism, among the players there. We find, Jack Parsons famously, the rocket scientist who was involved in, working with Aleister Crowley as an example. We jump ahead to the paperclip and bringing the Nazis over. And some of these people were true believers. They were real, pagans. Basically, they were neo-pagan Teutonic types who believed that, a lot of impossible things. So you had people who had a kind of religious or a spiritual conceit motivating them, who saw that the race for space was something that was deeply cultural. It wasn't just a scientific thing. It wasn't just something to do with technology or something to do with science or with, broadening the frontiers of science. This was something that at heart was going to be a challenge to religious thinking as well. That to leave the Earth, to leave the atmosphere of the Earth to go to another planet was basically shaking your fist at God. So there were a lot of people who were opposed to the space program for this reason. There were people who were afraid that, rockets would come back with cameras, with photographs showing that there was no God sitting on a cloud up there. I mean, there's some ridiculous stuff was going on, during the early days of the space program.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we were fighting with the Soviet Union, the godless atheist communists back in the 1950s, who were the first ones to launch a satellite. And therefore, it became a culture war as in addition to a scientific or a military conflict. This was the idea that the communists, the godless atheist communists, would master space before we did. So you cannot separate the religious weaponization idea that we have to, move our religions to the point where they're going to be effective tools to fight our enemies. You can't separate that out from our technological advances, from dropping the atomic bomb. I mean, I once had I think I still have it, a Roman Catholic missal, which for those of you who are not Catholic, it's a huge prayer book with all the different feast days in it, and the masses in it in Latin and English and all the rest of it. I had it since I was a kid. And for one of the holy days, there's a drawing, a picture of an atomic bomb explosion.
Mm-hmm.
And underneath it says in Latin, Ecce qui tollit peccata mundi, behold him who takes away the sins of the world. Which is a very weird thing to put underneath a picture of an atomic explosion.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So weaponizing religion, that's when I first got my taste of it. God is blessing the use of the atomic bomb. He's taking away the sins of the world through dropping a bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we've been involved with this since the beginning. You cannot separate them out. We in America like to think in terms of boxes. There's this box, there's that box. There's a religion box and there's a science box. And there's no such thing. It's all of a piece. It's all together. Human beings are human beings. Ronald Reagan was religious. His wife consulted astrologers. I mean, there's just no separating out this stuff. It's all part of the same program. We don't see it, on the ground, but it's there.
Have you heard of William Sims Bainbridge?
I've heard of William Bainbridge.
I imagine it's the same. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, if you know that institute.
Yes, right.
Because I just discovered him when I was working on Prisoner of Infinity, the exploration of Whitley Strieber's work, with particular attention to the key, and he has his connections to the military and the Pentagon and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a report on the Process Church. You might have come across him that way.
Oh, of course, that's right. Yeah, that's why I know the name.
Yeah.
Yes.
But yeah, the thing that's relevant here is his galactic religion. He proposes the idea of creating a galactic religion in order to give capitalism a boost, and in order to seed the necessary memes or beliefs and aspirations for space colonization. I think it's a largely pragmatic / cynical view of the whole thing, and that the idea is to create a galactic religion merely as a temporary measure or as a tool, like I say, weaponized religion in a sense, to inspire the necessary creativity and work to actually bring about a space colonization as a way to extend the capitalist empire beyond the planet.
But wasn't that the idea behind Scientology?
It was. I mean, he uses Scientology as one of his models, as far as they've been useful. I mean, he talks about these cults, he calls them audience cults. Well, Scientology is a real cult, but he also talks about audience cults, which would just be the field of ufology or tarot readers or people who, spiritualists. They're unofficial, they're not actually groups, but they're individuals who believe in the same or similar things, as all being very useful in terms of generating hope is one of the things he says is very important. Diffuse hope in some vague idea of heaven, but also seeding the kind of ideas that will inspire the activity that's necessary to bring about the reality, so to speak. Like Star Trek would be a very good example. The whole idea of space being populated has been not subtly really, but insidiously implanted in us by all these movies and TV shows, to the point that, and a film like 2001, of course, which takes it to the not just quasi but really the fully religious level of apotheosis, that sort of, so that it's like that impression that we've grown up with has been superimposed over, I would say, the reality, which is space is extremely cold, extremely huge, and full of rocks, you know.
Right.
Not the most inviting place, really.
That's true. I mean, we've been sort of programmed to think there would be, you know, other races, and what amazes me is the idea, the conceit that we have, that if we encountered one of these races, or they encountered us, that we'd actually be able to communicate with them. I don't think that's given at all.
No.
You know, I don't think communication between two different, like between ourselves and some other alien race, I don't think we should take that for granted. I mean, even though we could be thinking in terms of very primitive ideas of, you know, sign language or pictures or something, I still don't think that that's going to be an easy way to go. I don't think that kind of communication would necessarily exist, just like we can't communicate very well with insects, for instance. You know, there's no common context.
Yeah, even beyond that, there's a whole demographic on the planet now that we can't communicate with, our own species, with autistics.
Yes.
Like of discovering the autistics. For all we know, the alien could actually be among us and could be, you know, part of the species or subspecies or whatever you want to call it, but it could be right here under our noses and we wouldn't even recognize it. So
well, that's part of the Hollywood idea as well, though, isn't it? You know,
yeah.
That they are actually among us somehow.
Well,
already.
that's true, and also the glamorization of the autistic has become part of the Hollywood thing now, as
right.
well as that they're these very special psychic beings, and maybe even overlapping with ETs. So at some level we're conscious of that possibility, but of course turning it into entertainment is not a way to really address it. It seems to be a way not to address it, if anything. Possibly. I mean, maybe it's both.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a problem even with the term entertainment. It's like people will often ask me, you know, terms like that. I mean, as far as, you know, entertainment, like, do you watch television, or do you you know, what films do you like, or something? And I don't know if it's a psychological disorder where I'm concerned, but when I watch television programs or when I watch film, I don't feel that I'm being entertained. I mean, I'm watching these things for educational purposes, it seems. I'm looking for clues, you know. I watch them trying to understand something, trying to find some deeper level, some deeper meaning. I don't find myself sort of mindlessly eating popcorn and, you know, having my brain massaged. So, you know, maybe for some of us, entertainment is not what Hollywood thinks it is, you know, or maybe Hollywood's just as deliberate in what they're doing.
Yeah.
I guess what I mean is it's not going directly to my unconscious. It's right there in front of my consciousness. I'm seeing the clues. I'm seeing the that they're making. I'm seeing, you know, another drama being enacted that maybe is deliberate, maybe is not deliberate. I don't know, but I get very involved in watching things like this. So my consciousness is extremely, you know, focused on what's taking place. Right. In a way, I think that's not really entertaining. I mean, it's not a stress relief experience for me.
Right. Yeah, I have both experiences. But if a film, the less good a film is, the more I will switch into the mode that you're talking about, where I'll at least analyze it and see what clues it's given me. I recently watched The Hunger Games, or the third one, or whatever. By that point, I realised I would not be watching any more, but I stuck with it that long. Did you see any of those, or are you familiar with the story?
I did not. No, I know I'm familiar with the idea, but I haven't seen it.
Well, it occurred to me, I was watching it, there were all these scenes, it's about this, you know, the resistance, trying to resist the empire, basically, is the story, and there are all these sequences in which the members of the resistance visit the scenes of desolation where the empire has destroyed whole tribal communities, and there's these very strong, meant to be moving emotional sequences in which the characters are witnessing the devastation that's been wrought on their small primitive communities. And I was thinking, why are they putting so much into this? Why are they making it so dramatic when there are no Americans who can relate to this? No Americans have had this experience of having their community devastated by advanced technology. Mm-hmm. And suddenly it occurred to me, well, but that's how, Iraqis and Afghanistans and all the victims of American national policy, they have that experience, up to the point of, despair. That was puzzling at first, and then I realized it's like the abuser and the abused. Like, the Americans are identifying with their own victims and sort of enacting, perhaps it's to do with what you were talking about earlier, the guilt, the sense of what they're doing is not justifiable, and the way to justify it is, well, there's twofold. One is to keep doing it and keep identifying with the powerful position, and the other is kind of the inverse, which is to identify with the position of the victim in this very unconscious way, because of course America always represents itself in the Hollywood narrative as kind of an underdog. It's weird, if you think of a film like Die Hard, or any film like that, the hero who represents America is always pitted against these impossibly powerful forces.
Sure, and I think that in a situation that you just mentioned in the films, in Hunger Games, where they're visiting these scenes of destruction, we can only identify with fantasy victims.
Right.
We can't really identify with the real victims, because that would require an entire, soul searching of the country. It would tear us apart probably. Yeah. So what we do is we identify with we feel the guilt, we have it, it's there, it has to be. So what we're doing is we're transferring that guilt from the real victims, let's say the Iraqis of the last 10 years. We're transferring that guilt over to, fantasy victims. This kind of makes it easier to deal with. We can deal with some of that guilt. We can feel sorry. We can, identify even with those victims, to a certain extent, and feel righteous about what we're doing to everyone else.
Yeah. It's also with the Girardi and the scapegoat thing. It's essential that the guilt of the scapegoat is never questioned. If the idea of them being innocent enters into it, then the whole thing collapses.
Sure.
And yeah,
we can't bear to look at that.
Right. Well, it's essential that it isn't seen, because then the mechanism fails. But then at the same time, once the scapegoat has been sacrificed, it becomes a sacred. It's seen as sacred, because somehow unconsciously its role of binding the community together is unconsciously recognized, and so it's raised up in some way. So this could also be going on in that we've got these Hollywood narratives in which we're supposed to identify with the victims of this encroaching Borg-like, technological empire, which would clearly seem to correspond much more with the US than anything. We're invited to identify with the innocent victims of that as unconscious tokens, or whatever the word is. What's the word? Mascots or representatives of I'm going to say our own victims, but I'm not American. I'm not going to say your victims either, but of the empire's
that's all right.
Victims.
Okay. I won't take it personally.
It seems you've travelled enough to be able to disidentify as an American.
Yeah, I've been forced to disidentify.
Right.
So, but yeah, it's. You see the victimhood everywhere when you do travel. So. If you're sensitive to it, if you're paying attention, you'll see it. And if you're not paying attention, somebody's bound to bring it up eventually. But it's true. The scapegoat does then become divinized to a certain extent. It becomes sacralized. They were not conscious of being scapegoats, and they have attained a kind of apotheosis by being a scapegoat. Well, Jesus was the ultimate scapegoat, right? So I mean, we divinized, a scapegoat like that, sort of retroactively. We look back and we said, okay, he's divine. Although probably during his lifetime there was no question that, of that. He's the ideal, example of it. But let's say, I mean, and of course, there was this idea that Girard might have been, a crypto-Christian or something, trying to promote a Christian idea of scapegoat and redemption through being a scapegoat. But that, aside, I forgot where I was going, but yes, basically, the scapegoat concept, the United States needs scapegoats, and at the same time, it doesn't want to really look too close at the scapegoat, and that's perfectly consistent with Girard's concept. We need them, but we don't really want to see their suffering. We really don't want to be reminded of it. The Native Americans are a very good example of that. We kind of fold them back into the narrative. We kind of, try to deal with this, by making them basically culture heroes, which is another form of racism, exactly, but we don't see it that way. We see that we're, ennobling, the Native Americans who've suffered, and we bring them back and we make them sort of these noble creatures. They're not really human still, but they're out there representing something. I mean, it's a sickness that we feel compelled to keep, reinventing all the time. We just, the Native Americans today. Who's it going to be tomorrow? Is it going to be the Iraqis? For instance?
That speaks to the autism thing as well, because autists are being killed every day and tortured, and under the auspices of cures, and at the same time they're being romanticized and idealized by Hollywood and certain literature and whatnot.
Which is our safety valve, right? We're, on the one hand, we're persecuting them, on the other hand, we're idealizing them. It's Madonna and whore.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't really see people as people. You can break it down to almost any kind of category. Let's say the autistic. We're not seeing them as human beings. We're seeing them either as idealized people, or we're seeing them as people to be eradicated or controlled or cured. This is how we handle things.
It seems like that's a psychological mechanism in itself, that it's self-dehumanizing, not obviously with volition, but through trauma, that we have this internal guardian that punishes ourselves on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have this dissociated self that is a fantasy realm in which everything is perfect and ideal, and the two actually prop each other up.
Well, dissociation, we consider it to be a function of trauma. Is America dissociated, and if so, what was our trauma?
Have you thought about that?
I mean, it's very fashionable to talk about how America does the traumatizing.
Yeah.
But how has America been traumatized itself? Maybe the mere fact of this country is, in a sense, a kind of ongoing trauma. I mean, the dislocation of Europeans, Africans, and others coming to the country is the beginning of trauma. We've all have a trauma in our background because of that. And then the ongoing struggles here in this country to hold on to it, a civil war that we fought, countless other wars before and after. We're living in a constant state of trauma, and maybe it's self-inflicted, but can you self-inflict trauma and become dissociated through a self-inflicted trauma? That's something that I think psychology has yet to address. I mean, we talk about childhood trauma, so we take it for granted that's not self-inflicted, but is it possible to have a dissociative reaction to a self-inflicted trauma or a series of traumas? And again, self-inflicted may be too strong a term. Most people are just people, right? I mean, even though they came to this country and they tried to, build a life here, and they were fighting off, the Native Americans, how much agency do we give the individual Americans, right?
It's a tough one, isn't it? I was thinking about that earlier, like we're often inclined or directed to think of not of the individual but of groups, but in terms of trying to analyse what's going on, and certainly politics and history and all the rest of it, you don't generally talk about the individuals unless it's a biography of sorts. But
sure. But
actually, of course, groups are also made up of individuals, and so we're talking about individual psyches, individual traumas, which collectively would, if you factor in that individuals are drawn together by shared trauma, which has been studied, I think. I wouldn't say it's been
Sure.
proven, but it's certainly been postulated. Then you could say that groups are, by their very nature, have the individuals that make up groups do have matching traumas, and so that collective identity and the collective behaviour that stems from it can be sourced in multiple traumas, but that correspond. So, for example, with the US, you could say, well, the trauma that is embedded or inherent in the US identity would predate the foundation of the United States itself, in that the individuals who were driven to colonize the States may have been driven by their own individual traumas. Like what caused them to move in the first place? Something. And as you pointed out, the act of moving, maybe some of them were forced to move, were deported and the rest of it, their roots torn up. Others, perhaps they were already disrooted or in some way under siege internally or externally, and so they jumped on the opportunity to abandon the ship of their own homeland. That would certainly all seem to indicate trauma. Again, bringing it back to space, like who would want to go into space? We have a great planet here. I mean, there's an awful lot of talk about the problem on the planet, but it seems to me that the problems on the planet come down to a way of life rather than anything inherent to the biological or physical makeup of the planet itself.
Of course. 100%. Yeah. So we're looking at these empty lumps of rock out there as refuge. It's kind of strange, isn't it? I mean, it's if you think about it, it makes no sense. It is a psychopathology. I mean, it seems really strange. Let's go to the moon. Let's go to Mars. I mean, there's very serious talk now about sending a Mars mission up within the very short time, within the next couple of years.
Yeah, tourism even.
Tourism. Yeah.
Yeah.
What is that all about? I mean, yes, it is. It's very strange. I mean, of course, on one level, wow, would it be great to say that you visited Mars? Take 3 or 5 years out of your life, something like that, in order to go and come back, and to say you've seen Mars, but then, you bring back a couple of slides and you show it to your friends.
And that's it.
That's the end of it. Now what? So yeah, it is very strange if you think about it. The planet is enormously forgiving. Maybe it's not 100% forgiving. I mean, we're causing a lot of damage if you believe in that sort of thing. If you believe that climate change is human controlled, which I personally do think we're having an effect. But still, the planet is very forgiving. It's sustained us for this long. It could sustain us for a lot longer if we were sensible about it. And not just sustain us, but we could thrive.
Yeah.
The problem is us. Like the old Pogo comic strip, we've met the enemy and he's us. We're the problem. Going to space is only going to move the problem someplace else. Or extend the problem rather. It won't move it from this planet, but it will, put the planet, put the problems on Mars, put the problems someplace else, on some other star, in some other galaxy. We'll start infecting the whole galaxy, the whole universe. I mean, it's bizarre, But this is what we think. We're still trying to get away. We're still thinking in terms of manifest destiny. We're still trying to get to the Pacific coast and take everything in between. We can't stop it.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but we cannot stop moving. We're running from something. the metaphor that I use, or I should say the analogy that I use, is that of the serial killer. The serial killer keeps committing the same crime over and over again because that's the only that refers to some trauma that happened in murky history, in his own personal or her own personal history. And they keep reenacting this particular crime. The ritualistic aspects of it refer to something that actually happened. They're trying to neutralize that. They're trying to find some sort of resolution of that problem, and of course they can't.
Yeah.
And that's part of the pathology. They have to keep committing the same crime over and over again in exactly the same way, and it's a compulsion they cannot stop. And I'm frightened that we as a society are, in a similar circumstance. We're going to have to keep committing the same crime. We can talk all we want to about, rationally finding a solution to it, but a serial killer is not rational in our terms. They're still in the throes of this shamanic experience in which they have to keep committing this act of violence to reach this individuated state, or that's what the compulsion is. Whether that's going to lead to individuation or not, of course, is open to question. I mean, it will not if it's exteriorized, if it's externalized.
Mm-hmm.
So we externalize our problems as a country. We don't internalize them. We're not calm about our problems. We're not willing to sit and talk about it in a kind of rational way. We have to do this through violence for some reason, and we have to keep committing the same crime over and over again. And this is the part that's worrisome. I mean, this is when everybody says to themselves, okay, screw this, I'm going to, reach my own individuation. I'm going to take my own path. I'm going to leave society because society itself is sick. There's nothing I can do to help it. So I'm going to go and escape, and I'm going to become individuated. I'm going to attain nirvana or reach advaita, non-duality, or whatever term we want to give it. And this is the problem I've had since the 1960s, when I've been sort of torn between, should you be politically aware and politically involved and worry about the rest of society and devote yourself to that on the one hand, or should I go off, to the desert or to the wilderness and pursue a spiritual objective, which seems extremely selfish on the face of it, to abandon society and just to do my own thing. And maybe if I come back as an enlightened person, I'll be helping society somehow in the long run, or at least that's what I can tell myself.
So it sounds like you ended up taking the middle way.
Yes, I certainly have.
Yeah. Which I think is the only way. I think what you're describing is another pseudo problem, because I would say, again, my experience is that the world and all its ills and pathologies is an individuation chamber. It provides all the opportunities we need and more than we would actually want, but all the ones we need, just like marriage, to see our own patterns. And the whole reenactment thing, as you're describing it as a serial killer as a metaphor, I discovered a lot, again, exploring what the Strieber's were, and the idea that alien abduction was a kind of reenactment ritual, whether or not it involved real aliens, that we unconsciously reenact the trauma that we experienced in order to try and resolve it. But as long as it's unconscious, we don't resolve it. We just add trauma after trauma. We just keep, perpetuating the wound. But at a certain point, potentially, this probably doesn't happen ever with serial killers, because I think once you've already crossed that line, it's probably too late. But it could happen, I don't know. But if at a certain point we become conscious, oh, here I am again, this is happening all over again, and become conscious of some unconscious agency in us which is bringing about the reenactment, then an unconscious reenactment becomes a conscious reenactment. Mm-hmm. And at that point something shifts.
Exactly.
Something definitely shifts at that point. It's not that you have control over it suddenly, it's just that if you become conscious of doing something, a space opens up in which you are not the compulsion. You become separate from the compulsion, I think.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I wonder, in society in general, how that obtains. I don't really write about individuals as much as I write about, in general terms, social groups and what they do, and whether it's cults or political parties or whatever. When you're talking about reliving a trauma over and over again, I couldn't help thinking, because of the way I was brought up and my own personal background. I mean, isn't the Catholic Mass a reenactment of a trauma? That goes on, and every single day, and all over the world, we reenact this constant trauma. Is that a healthy thing? I don't know. At this point, if reenacting the trauma of a crucified human being. I mean, my first experience of going into a Catholic church, because I was brought up as a Catholic, going into a church and seeing that horrible image of a man nailed to a cross, bleeding and dead or dying, as the centerpiece of this thing. Right. I couldn't get it on board. I couldn't understand what I was looking at. And when people went up to take communion, my feeling was they were all going up there to die. That was my initial reaction as a child. They're all going up to die.
Wow.
That's death up there, And that's my first reaction as a Catholic. It took years to get that straightened out, and even then was not that successful. But it's the idea that this is a trauma that is reenacted all over the world in all different kinds of ways. And from a psychological point of view, what does that mean? Is this something that we still haven't been able to rid ourselves with? Is there something internal that's going on that has not been rectified yet? And of course, many people will tell you absolutely. We have not gotten past that crucifixion stage. We're still reenacting it because there's something we're dealing with that we can't quite solve.
Perhaps it's again the element of consciousness is key, because if people, when you were a child, nobody explained to you the mechanism of catharsis, let's say. If that's right. What a Catholic ritual, a reenactment potentially is cathartic, in that we get to really experience and integrate the original pain, the original trauma, whether it's collective or individual, and then move past it. But if nobody explains that, or if you're not guided to see it, maybe it can't actually be explained, then the cathartic ritual, whatever we want to call it, maybe it's even shamanic, like Greek theatre as well, of course, was this, and theatre wasn't entertainment for the Greeks. It had this psychological function, and presumably that was understood in the community. They were very careful, Girard says, not to depict the violence, because so that the audience would feel the build-up and the need for this, the catharsis, the need, the impending inevitability of the reenactment, but they wouldn't be given the relief, by the priestcraft or whoever, or Hollywood. They would have to take it away, or right there in the performance, they would have to internalize the release, or the epiphany, or the catharsis, or whatever it is that happens. The seeing, they would have to see the unconscious mechanism that was driving the whole show, and I guess trigger it in a way that it was released. There was no longer that internal tension. But if that doesn't happen, then we have a religion that's not an empty show, because it's, as I think we're touching on, like Hollywood, it's very, very meaningful and powerful, but perhaps in the wrong ways. It's more of a manipulation than an initiation.
Well, also if you witness the Mass for the first time, or you witness it a few times over the course of one's life, then it probably is a lot more powerful. But when you're expected to go to church every Sunday at least, at the minimum, or my grandparents went every single day, at a certain point, the repetition has got to, the performance, let's say, the celebration of the Mass has to lose its psychological power, through the constant repetition. I mean, you're seeing something else every single time, I think. You're no longer seeing the death and resurrection of Christ. You're no longer seeing, the consumption of flesh and blood. You've got to, either your mind wanders, or, there's something else is going on. You're seeing something else that's not there. You'd kind of have to, because you couldn't go through a traumatic experience like that every single Sunday. Right. So what do you do? I mean, what actually is taking place then? This is probably way beyond the scope of this discussion, but you ask yourself, what is really happening, and what is the relationship between the body and the religion? I mean, the body is such an important focal point the physical body of this, especially of Catholicism. I think among most religions in the West, anyway, leaving aside for a second India and other religions in that part of the world, but in the West, it's Catholicism that has the cross and the body on it, and it's sort of very Foucauldian. I mean, you're asking yourself about blood and eros. In the case of Foucault, talking about the centrality of the body and the manipulation of the body and the persecution of it by the state and all the rest of it. It's is that part of what's bringing people back constantly? Is this are they identifying really with that body on the cross? What is really taking place there? That would be interesting to find out. I think no one really bothers to psychoanalyze Catholics anymore, but except maybe Girard. They're ripe for it. Except Girard, yeah.
I sent you an email about enlightenment, the possibility of trying to evolutionarily engineer some sort of enlightenment state through trauma, and this idea seems to be growing in popularity. It's not quite the word, but it's been given a lot of credence and getting a lot of airplay, if you will, and how this relates to, I mean, how I've come to understand it or begin to understand it is what you're talking about is it's dissociation versus embodiment, like how embodied we can be, having been traumatized, physically traumatized. The psyche, as it were, flees, as I was talking about before. It fragments. It can't land in the body, and that's dissociation, or that is one aspect of that experience we would call dissociation, and it can be very pleasant. Actually, I mean, that's the point, right? You enter into a state where you're somewhat disembodied, and you don't have to experience the distress of the body and the trauma within it. And so I think there's a mechanism here between, and there's something about that I included here about the cure that almost works. There's nothing so popular and persistent as a cure that almost works, because you keep going back to it. You keep thinking this time it will work, because of course a cure that works, you can't sell that. That's it, you're cured. A cure that doesn't work at all, you don't try it again, you just think it's snake oil. But the cure that almost works will keep people coming back time and time again. So this is Hollywood, I would say. It almost offers you relief from the endless anxiety of your existence, but never quite. And obviously it doesn't last, even if it does. And also the Catholic Mass, that it offers you some semblance of a taste of embodiment, because, as you say, you're being identified with the body on the cross and the pain of that, and in Hollywood, of course, all the violence, but in a way that's actually, it's also dissociative, because you're not really, it's a fantasy, it's an imagined thing. So you kind of get to have your cake and eat it. You get to feel a bit more embodied, which is a relief from the sort of terror of annihilation and non-existence that dissociation threatens, but also you have the pleasant sort of numb fantasy anesthetic of a dissociative fantasy in which you're really just projecting the experience or projecting yourself into an experience.
Well, I think that to go to your original question about the relationship between trauma and enlightenment, or the idea that this might be possible, I think that trauma, it's not universal that trauma is going to lead to enlightenment. Obviously, trauma can lead to all sorts of disorders and can lead to, as you say, dissociation. Especially, in children, has been pointed out, I think, in a lot of studies that, trauma will lead to some kind of dissociation. Those who still believe in dissociative identity disorder, and there's controversy over that as well, as we all know. But I think it's reasonable to assume that this is what happens, at least in some cases. But will trauma, automatically lead to some sort of sense of enlightenment? No, I don't think so. I think that, if that's so, then my goodness, the whole world would be on the verge of total enlightenment. So I mean, the trauma that we have is not, very conducive, I think, to these states. I think it depends on set and setting, as we used to say in the LSD culture. It depends upon the environment, the context in which this trauma is taking place. and the setup leading towards it. I think that trauma on its own doesn't necessarily, in fact, 99% of the time does not lead to any enlightened spiritual states. It will lead to dissociation, an escape from what's going on, and that's sort of the opposite of what we mean from enlightenment, which would be total engagement, right?
Right, but it can be.
I think dissociation is not.
If we're sort of misinformed about what enlightenment is, we could easily mistake the two. And what I noticed, again, with my Whitley Strieber exploration was, or became aware of rather, was how in the West, and this is the occult path, obviously it's related, we seem to, because enlightenment isn't really a Western idea, we seem to confuse the idea of awakening psychic potential with enlightenment and conflate these two ideas. Right. Whereas in fact in the East they're opposed. Right?
They're quite opposed. Yeah, I mean the subject of Tantra leads us to that. You know, the Buddhist and Hindu tantras break down into two different fields. I mean, the initial impetus behind Tantra was to obtain psychic powers, right? The siddhis, to obtain a great deal of psychic abilities and magical powers, you might say. And then around the 10th, 11th century, there was sort of a sea change that took place, and then Tantra was supposed to be only to lead you to a state of non-duality. And the idea was that Tantra would lead you to enlightenment, that the pursuit of the individual psychic powers and abilities was a low Tantra, which very low and very unworthy. The problem was that in terms of society in general, in Indian society, we might make a generalization here. The lower form of Tantra, the ones that the forms of Tantra that gave you the powers and the abilities, the siddhis, were more popular among the people, right. Certainly, because the other form of Tantra, which was kind of a quietistic, hermetic, approach, which was leading towards more meditation, more hatha yoga, more concentration and removal from society, to attain a state of being which seemed to have no particular usefulness to society. The people in general reacted against. They didn't feel this was appropriate. So Tantra began to bifurcate into these two different streams. And I think that's enlightenment in the sense of non-duality, or whatever you want to call it, or identification with a deity, or transcending normal consciousness is one thing. And then there was the idea that enlightenment might be the pursuit of tremendous powers that are latent in the human mind and the human brain, or the physiology, which might also be considered enlightening. It depends where you stand. I mean, to us, if we have not attained any of these states, it all seems pretty good. Whether it's talking about having magical powers, or finding bliss in a state of nirvana or oneness with God, it's all a lot better than what we have now. So people would be drawn to it no matter what, right? So enlightenment, it's as good a term as any, especially for us in the West. But I think you're completely right. We can confuse these spiritual states with enlightenment, and there's nothing at all similar, even in the Western practice, even according to Crowley, to bring up that bugaboo. Yeah. Crowley said people who were following magic, or the magical path for the attainment of magical powers, were people who had not crossed the abyss. They had fallen into it. These were what he called, quote unquote, the Black Brothers, people who were black magicians who were only pursuing magic for mundane ends. So even Crowley understood on some level that you had to transcend this idea of pursuing magic for mundane ends and only pursue it for higher spiritual ends, which to the practical magicians, to use their critique, meant that Crowley had not attained anything. Yeah, he was just simply using that as an excuse, because he had no magical powers. Therefore, he said, "Well, I'm just enlightened. That's why I have no magical powers." Oh, I see. So, you see what I mean? So I mean, it's a double-edged sword. So unless you are enlightened, the power of discernment once again gets called into question. Yeah, that's because I would counter to that the drive for enlightenment. It's not as though we can just intellectually say, okay, enlightenment doesn't mean superpowers, so if I'm going for enlightenment, that means I'm free of the will to power, right? It's still likely to be the same drive, because it's operating at an unconscious level, and as you pointed out, anything is better than what we've got. So
the very thing that's driving us to this state, it would seem, would be the thing that would determine. I don't know how to finish that sentence actually, but my feeling about this is again based on a sort of failed will to power path of many years, decades even, is that just being in the body is really all we're talking about here, just being all the way in the body, and that there's nothing magical or fantastic or strange or mystical about that. It's just being here. It's absolutely being present, wholly integrated in the body, and that all of the mystical states and visions and the psychic powers and the aliens and the remote viewing and all of that, they may be all red herrings. They may all be the results of psychic fragmentation, which does let in all kinds of weird and strange experiences, it seems like, because if you're not simply grounded and rooted in the body, there's this whole sort of smorgasbord, or this weird fuzzy twilight zone of real and unreal, in which all kinds of psychic phenomena occur, but that are getting filtered through the mind or through the identity. And so are kind of endlessly fascinating, like dreaming, I suppose. Whereas embodiment, I think, is very unglamorous, very unromantic, very unexciting by its nature, at the same time as being the thing, the only thing that really works. We were talking earlier about how we need the space to go inward and to integrate the unconscious, which is maybe, again, this bid to conquer space is an unconscious feeling of, oh my God, I need space. But it seems like that's a conundrum that will never be resolved until we actually are willing, as the saying is, to sit still in a room, not literally, I'm not a meditator myself, but to find the space internally, regardless of how little space there is outside. In fact, even the less space there is outside of us, the more the world is pressing on us, that may be the true evolutionary thing, if you will, that doesn't require human intervention, that we are being driven just by circumstances to discover the internal space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very eloquent way to put it. Part of the problem is we don't really know how to define enlightenment, and we don't know the powers that you talk about may simply be side effects of attaining altered states or higher states of awareness, or being deeper within the body, because we don't know really what the body can do. We've been told what is possible and what is not possible, but we don't really understand how it works. Really, I think that maybe one path that has potential among all of the things we've discussed, if you look at the original statement of the Rosicrucian Society back in the 17th century, the idea was that their only purpose was to help others. The idea of attaining these abilities, these powers, was to actually perform healing, to work as doctors towards society. That anything else was not permitted, was not allowed within the order. Of course, the Rosicrucians being an imaginary fraternity at the time, the whole thing being a ludibrium, as it was stated by Andre, was an idea maybe whose time had not come yet, but the idea that spiritual path may simply be a path in which somebody finally decides that they're going to follow that path in order to, in the end, help other people. Be a doctor, in a sense, be a doctor of the soul maybe, but or be an alchemist who develops an elixir to cure illnesses, or whatever it happens to be. But if it's a will to power, if it's self-centered, if it's to make yourself powerful at the expense of others, then that is doomed to failure. Maybe that's true. Maybe the Rosicrucians or whoever invented that idea had the right idea, that the only way to become a spiritually enlightened person, to become an initiate, was to decide that you were going to devote yourself to the betterment of other human beings, like in India, to become a bodhisattva, to devote yourself to helping society at large. Maybe that's as good a place as any to leave that discussion.
Yes, I was going to say, I very much want to give you the last word, particularly seeing as if I say something else, you will inevitably have a response. So I'm definitely not going to get the last word. But yeah, we've been on 3 hours exactly. Oh my God, 3 hours and 3 seconds when I said that. So great. I did not expect to be on this long at all, and my butt is killing me, so I'm
Okay.
going to have to tend to the body.
There you go.